After I quit my job, I bought my dream beach house to heal. On the first night, my mother called. "We are moving in tomorrow. Your dad said it is fine." I just froze. She even added that if I did not like it, I could find somewhere else. My hands shook, but I smiled. I prepared a surprise for their arrival. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Vanessa, and I am 34 years old. Until very recently, I was a high-level financial auditor for a major corporate firm. The burnout had been real, the hours grueling, and the stress suffocating. So I stepped down. To the outside world, and specifically to my family, I simply quit because I could not handle the pressure. Let them think what they wanted. I had spent my entire life trying to prove my worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I took my massive severance package, combined it with years of incredibly smart investments, and bought myself a sanctuary, a $4 million modern beach house in Destin, Florida. It was a masterpiece of glass and white oak sitting right on the pristine white sand, with unobstructed views of the emerald water. I had moved in just days prior. The salty breeze blowing off the Gulf of Mexico felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest. I thought I had finally bought myself some peace. I thought distance and financial independence would be the shield I needed against the toxic dynamic I had endured my entire life. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday morning. I was standing on my expansive second-floor balcony, sipping my morning coffee and listening to the rhythmic crash of the waves. The sun was just beginning to warm the teak wood decking beneath my bare feet. For a fleeting moment, everything was perfect. Then the jarring screech of air brakes shattered the tranquility. I looked over the glass railing toward the front of my property. A massive, bright orange U-Haul moving truck was reversing aggressively into my pristine paver driveway. The driver misjudged the angle completely. With a loud, sickening crunch, the heavy rear bumper of the truck slammed right into my custom stone mailbox, sending chunks of masonry tumbling into the manicured landscaping. My heart hammered against my ribs as the truck doors swung open. Out stepped my father, Richard, looking as arrogant and self-assured as ever in his golf polo and khakis. From the passenger side emerged my mother, Barbara, already adjusting her designer sunglasses and looking around my property with a critical, appraising eye. Behind the moving truck, a sleek luxury SUV pulled up and parked on the street. The doors opened and out stepped my younger sister, Ashley, the undisputed golden child of the family, followed closely by her husband, Kevin. I stood frozen on this balcony, my coffee mug suddenly feeling incredibly heavy in my trembling hands. This was not a visit. This was an invasion. Before I could even process the reality of the situation, the front doors of the moving truck flew open, and 3 burly movers jumped out, unlatching the back ramp. My mother marched straight up my front walkway, completely ignoring the destroyed mailbox, and began barking orders at the men. I set my mug down on the patio table and rushed inside, flying down the floating glass staircase to the main foyer. Just as my feet hit the bottom step, the heavy oak front door was pushed wide open. Barbara strolled in without knocking, without hesitating, treating my $4 million sanctuary like it was her own personal hotel. "Take those boxes straight upstairs," she yelled over her shoulder to the movers, gesturing wildly with her manicured hand. "The master suite is the one with the double doors at the end of the hall. Put the heavy dressers against the far wall so we have room for the sitting area." I stepped directly into the pathway of the staircase, blocking the 2 large men carrying a massive oak dresser. "Stop right there!" I commanded, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. "Put that down outside. You are not bringing a single piece of furniture up these stairs." The movers paused, exchanging confused glances, clearly caught in the middle of a family dispute they wanted no part of. Barbara let out a sharp, exasperated sigh and rolled her eyes, pulling off her sunglasses. "Vanessa, do not be difficult right now," she snapped, waving her hand as if shooing away a pesky insect. "We have been driving for 14 hours and I am exhausted. Move out of the way so these men can do their jobs. We are paying them by the hour." "I am not moving," I said, planting my feet firmly on the bottom step. What do you think you are doing? Why is there a moving truck in my driveway? My father walked through the front door, stepping over the threshold with the casual entitlement of a king inspecting his newly conquered territory. He stopped beside my mother, crossing his arms over his chest and looking at me with that familiar dismissive glare I had known since childhood. "We told you last night," Richard scoffed, his tone thick with condescension. "We sold our house. We are moving in." "You left a voicemail saying you were coming," I shot back, my voice rising. "You did not say you were moving in permanently with a truck full of furniture. This is my house. I bought this property. You cannot just show up and claim it." Richard let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed in the high-ceilinged foyer. "Do not be ridiculous, Vanessa. You are unemployed and you are single. What on earth could you possibly need with 6 bedrooms and 5,000 square feet of space? It makes absolutely zero logical sense for you to hoard this much house while your family needs a place to stay." I stared at him, absolutely bewildered by the sheer audacity of his reasoning. "So your solution is to just take it?" I asked, my voice tight with anger. "It is the only practical arrangement." Richard continued, speaking to me as if I were a slow child. "Ashley and Kevin are taking the master suite upstairs. Your mother and I are taking the 2 guest suites overlooking the water. We need the space for my home office setup. You can take the basement down by the garage. It is perfectly fine for 1 person." The basement. The unfinished windowless basement where the pool equipment and excess storage were meant to go. They had planned this out entirely, allocating my beautiful oceanfront rooms to themselves and banishing me to the concrete cellar of my own home. Before I could even formulate a response to that absolute disrespect, Ashley strolled through the open front door. She looked radiant, perfectly styled, and completely unapologetic. Without a word of greeting, she walked right past me into the kitchen, tossing her heavy, studded designer handbag right onto the center of my pristine white marble kitchen island. The sharp metal hardware scraped loudly against the delicate stone surface. "Careful," I snapped instinctively, moving toward the kitchen. "That is soft marble." Ashley rolled her eyes, letting out a dramatic sigh, as if my concern for my own property was a massive inconvenience to her. "Oh, stop overreacting, Vanessa. It is just a kitchen counter. Honestly, you need to calm down and stop being so selfish." Selfish. I repeated the word, tasting bitter on my tongue. "I buy a home with my own money. You break and assign away my bedrooms, and you call me selfish." "It is exactly what you always do." Ashley smirked, leaning against my counter and crossing her arms. "You always have to make everything about you. It is just like when Dad made you give me your car for college. Do you remember that? You threw a massive fit over a stupid used sedan. I was pre-law. I had internships and important study groups to get to. You were just crunching numbers in an accounting program. You did not need a car as much as I did. Family shares, Vanessa. You need to learn how to be a team player." The memory hit me like a physical blow. I had worked 2 part-time jobs during high school to buy that car, saving every single dollar. When Ashley went to college 2 years later, my parents simply took my keys and handed them to her, telling me I could take the bus, because my sister's future was more important than my convenience. They had always treated my hard work as a communal resource to be harvested for Ashley's benefit. "You are not taking my house like you took my car," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously low register. I looked at the movers who were still standing awkwardly by the front door. "Take that dresser back to the truck. All of you get off my property right now before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, unlocking the screen and pulling up the dial pad. I was fully prepared to call 911 and watch the authorities drag them out of my foyer. I had drawn a line in the sand, and for the first time in my life, I was not going to let them cross it. "Go ahead and call them," Richard said calmly. His lack of panic was deeply unsettling. He did not yell. He did not try to grab the phone from my hand. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his golf jacket and slowly pulled out a folded piece of paper. He smoothed it out with deliberate, agonizing slowness. "Call the police," he repeated, a victorious smirk playing on his lips. "But you might want to look at this first." He held the document out toward me. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before snatching it from his hand. It was a wrinkled, officially stamped piece of paper, heavy with notarized seals and formal legal language. My eyes scanned the text, rapidly picking out the key phrases. My heart stopped dead in my chest. "It is a power of attorney," Richard explained, his voice echoing with absolute triumph. "You signed it 5 years ago when you went abroad for that audit project in Europe. You told me to hold on to it in case there was an emergency with your taxes or your apartment lease while you were out of the country." I remembered the document. I had given it to him years ago out of a misguided sense of trust, believing he would only use it if something catastrophic happened to me while I was thousands of miles away across the ocean. I had completely forgotten it even existed. I kept it safe. Richard continued, taking a step closer to me. "And yesterday, I took it down to the county clerk's office. I used my legal authority as your designated representative to add my name to the deed of this house." The air rushed out of my lungs. I looked at the bottom of the page, seeing the official stamps and the fresh filing dates. He had essentially signed my property over to himself on my behalf. "So go ahead and call the police, Vanessa." Richard sneered, looking down at me with cold, ruthless satisfaction. "Tell them you want us removed. The police cannot do a single thing because legally I am a co-owner of this property. I have exactly as much right to be standing in this foyer as you do." I stood completely paralyzed, the legal document trembling in my hand. The absolute betrayal washed over me in suffocating waves. They had not just shown up uninvited. They had meticulously planned a legal coup to steal my $4 million home out from under me. They thought they had trapped me, thought they had outsmarted the quiet, compliant middle child they had pushed around for 3 decades. They thought they had won. But as I looked from my father's smug face to my mother's entitled glare, and finally to my sister's mocking smile, the shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. They had no idea what I had learned during my years as an auditor, dismantling fraudulent companies and exposing corporate criminals. They wanted to play a game of paper and power. They had no idea they had just walked right into my trap. My blood ran cold, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I smoothed my expression into a mask of total indifference. I took a slow, deliberate breath and simply stepped aside. The movers, sensing the tension breaking, hoisted the massive oak dresser and continued their march up my floating glass staircase. My mother brushed past me with a triumphant scoff, trailing her fingers along the custom railing. I watched Ashley and Kevin follow her like loyal subjects entering a conquered castle. I did not utter a single word of protest. I let them carry their bags and their unearned arrogance right up to my master suite. I turned on my heel and headed toward the basement door. I needed to act quickly and silently. As I made my way down the hallway toward the lower level, a harsh grating screech echoed from the attached garage. I pushed the fire door open and froze. Kevin was violently dragging a stack of splintered wooden crates across the pristine epoxy floor. Deep, ugly gouges trailed behind the heavy boxes, ruining the flawless finish I had paid thousands to have installed just last week. "Stop what you are doing right now," I ordered, my voice cutting through the echoing garage. "You are destroying the floor. What even is this garbage?" Kevin dropped the crate with a loud thud, wiping sweat from his forehead. He gave me a condescending smirk that made my skin crawl. "It is inventory, Vanessa. High-end nutritional supplements for my new startup. I need a place to store it while we scale up operations. Your garage was empty anyway, so do not make a big deal out of a few scratches." I stepped closer, staring at the absolute mess he was making of my property. "You are not running a warehouse out of my home, Kevin. Get a storage unit," I said, keeping my tone deadly calm. "Move these crates outside immediately." Before Kevin could formulate a response, the heavy door from the mudroom swung open and my father marched in. He placed a protective hand on Kevin's shoulder and glared at me. "Leave him alone," Richard demanded, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Kevin is an entrepreneur. He is trying to build a legacy for your sister and his future family. He is the son I always wanted. You should be taking notes from him instead of acting like a jealous spinster." The insult was designed to shatter me, For years, they had weaponized my single status against me, treating my lack of a husband as a fundamental character flaw. They worshipped Kevin simply because he put a ring on Ashley's finger, completely ignoring the fact that his last 3 business ventures had spectacularly failed, costing our family thousands. I looked at the 2 men standing in my garage, united in their disdain for me. I could have thrown my bank account balance in their faces. I could have told them exactly what I thought of Kevin's latest get-rich-quick scheme, but true power lies in knowing when to strike. "Do what you want," I said flatly. I turned my back on them and walked away, descending the stairs into the basement. The basement was entirely unfinished, a vast expanse of concrete and exposed pipes that I had planned to renovate into a home theater next year. But it was secure, and more importantly, it was out of their sight. I pulled my laptop from my tote bag and set it up on a folding table I had left down here during the move. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the massive surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I opened my encrypted files and initiated a secure call to David, my personal attorney. While the line connected, I pulled up the digitized records of my estate planning. My family believed I was a broken, unemployed woman retreating to the beach because I could not handle corporate life. They believed I had drained my meager savings to rent this house, or that I was living beyond my means. The truth was vastly different. I had not quit my job due to stress. I had negotiated a massive severance package after uncovering a critical financial discrepancy at my former firm. Combined with aggressive, highly successful investments I had made over the last decade, I was quietly sitting on a multi-million-dollar net worth. I retired early at 34. This house was bought in cash under a limited liability company I exclusively controlled. David answered on the third ring. "Vanessa," he said, his professional tone coming through the speaker. "Everything all right down in Florida? I need you to pull my revocation files from 3 years ago," I told him, keeping my voice low. "Specifically, the revocation of the power of attorney I granted to my father, Richard." I heard the clicking of a keyboard on David's end. "I have it right here. It was formally revoked, notarized, and filed with the state 3 years ago. He has zero legal authority over you or your assets. Why do you ask?" "Because he just stood in my foyer and showed me the old document." I explained, my eyes scanning the digital copy on my screen. "He claims he used it yesterday at the county clerk's office to add his name to the deed of my property." A heavy silence fell over the line. When David spoke again, all pleasantries were gone. "Vanessa, if he used a revoked power of attorney to alter a property deed, that is blatant prosecutable fraud. It is a felony. I can have local law enforcement at your house in 10 minutes to remove him." "No," I said quickly. "Do not call the police. Not yet." David sighed, a sound of lawyerly frustration. "You cannot let them stay there. Once they establish residency, removing them becomes a nightmare of tenant rights and eviction courts." "I know exactly what I'm doing, David. I want him to think he got away with it. I want them to unpack their bags, settle in, and believe they have won. Let him build his entire house of cards on that fraudulent deed. When I tear it down, I want to make sure it destroys everything he has. Just prepare the fraud documentation and have it ready to file the moment I give the signal." "Understood," David replied. "Call me the second you are ready to drop the hammer." I ended the call and closed the legal files. My family thought I was hiding in the basement, crying over my lost bedroom and my ruined life. Instead, I was preparing their financial execution. I opened a separate secure application on my laptop. When I purchased this $4 million property, I had the contractors install a state-of-the-art military-grade smart home security system. Tiny high-definition cameras were embedded discreetly in the crown molding of every common area: the kitchen, the living room, the hallways, and the exterior perimeters. I originally installed them for peace of mind while traveling. Now they were my ultimate weapon. I typed in my master passcode and activated the internal feeds. My screen split into a grid of crystal-clear, real-time video streams. I could see my mother directing movers in the master suite, her face twisted in a permanent scowl of entitlement. I watched Ashley lounging on my expensive living room sofa, her shoes propped up on the delicate fabric, scrolling through her phone without a care in the world. The audio feeds were impeccably sharp. I could hear every snide comment, every complaint about the layout of my house, every arrogant chuckle. They had willingly locked themselves inside a surveillance cage of their own making. I needed water. The adrenaline was making my mouth completely dry. Leaving my laptop securely locked and running, I quietly climbed the basement stairs and slipped into the back entrance of the kitchen. The movers were busy upstairs, and my father was outside barking at someone on his phone. The kitchen was momentarily empty, save for the massive pile of chaotic clutter Ashley and my mother had dumped onto the counters. As I reached for a glass from the cabinet, my eyes fell on a messy stack of mail spilling out of a crushed cardboard box my mother had brought in. It was a chaotic mix of magazines, junk mail, and official envelopes forwarded from their old address. One specific envelope caught my immediate attention. It was bright yellow, sent via certified mail, and bore the unmistakable seal of a major national bank. The flap had been hastily torn open, the contents partially protruding. I glanced at the hallway to ensure I was still alone. My heart hammered as I slid the thick packet of papers out of the yellow envelope. The bold, capitalized letters at the top of the first page practically jumped off the paper. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. I scanned the document rapidly. My parents had missed 6 consecutive mortgage payments. Their accounts were entirely depleted. The bank had officially seized their property 4 days ago. The narrative they had so proudly paraded into my home, the story of selling their house to downsize and gracefully move in with their single daughter to help her out, was a complete and utter lie. They did not sell their house. They lost it. They were entirely broke, stripped of their assets, and running from creditors. They had driven straight to Florida because my home was the only roof left that they could try to steal. They were not just arrogant family members pushing boundaries. They were desperate squatters clinging to a fraudulent deed to avoid living on the street. I carefully slid the foreclosure notice back into the yellow envelope and placed it exactly where I had found it. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. My parents had always valued their pristine social image above their own children. They judged everyone based on wealth and status, punishing me for years because I refused to play their shallow games. Now I held the absolute proof of their ultimate failure in my hands. The golden facade was completely hollow. They had brought their desperate sinking ship right into my harbor, and I was going to let them drown. I walked out of the kitchen, the thick yellow envelope clutched firmly in my right hand. The smooth, cool hardwood floors beneath my feet grounded me as I navigated through the chaotic obstacle course my family had already made of my main floor. Cardboard boxes were stacked carelessly against my custom Venetian plaster walls, scraping the delicate finish. The movers had hauled in a massive, outdated floral sofa that violently clashed with my modern minimalist aesthetic, dropping it right in the center of the living room. Barbara was already sitting on it. She had kicked off her shoes and was resting her bare feet on my glass coffee table, examining her manicured nails while shouting directions at a mover who was struggling with a heavy floor lamp. She looked completely at home, entirely unbothered by the fact that she had just orchestrated a hostile takeover of her daughter's property. I stepped into her line of sight, blocking her view of the mover. She let out a loud, irritated sigh and dropped her hands to her lap. "What is it now, Vanessa?" She snapped, her tone laced with absolute exhaustion, as if my very presence in my own home was a terrible burden she was being forced to bear. "I told you to stay out of the way until we are unpacked. You are hovering, and it is making my anxiety act up." I did not say a word. I simply raised my right hand and dropped the crumpled yellow envelope directly onto her lap. It landed with a soft, definitive smack against her designer trousers. Barbara glanced down at the paper, her eyes catching the bold, red certified mail stamp and the stark black lettering of the bank's return address. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flash of genuine panic cross her face. Her perfectly drawn eyebrows twitched and her jaw tightened. But my mother had spent her entire adult life perfecting the art of denial, and the mask of arrogant entitlement slid right back into place almost instantly. She pushed the envelope off her lap, letting it flutter to the floor as if it were a piece of filthy trash. You did not sell your house, I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the movers. You went bankrupt. I watched her closely, waiting for the shame, the tears, or even a desperate attempt at a lie. I expected her to deny it, to claim it was a clerical error or a misunderstanding with the bank. Instead, Barbara did not even flinch. She crossed her arms over her chest, lifted her chin, and glared at me with a look of absolute burning resentment. We went bankrupt paying for your sister's wedding and Kevin's business loans, she stated, her voice sharp and unapologetic. Do you have any idea how much a destination wedding in Amalfi costs, Vanessa? Do you know what kind of capital is required to get a tech startup off the ground? We sacrificed our financial security to make sure Ashley and Kevin had the foundation they needed to succeed in life. That is what real families do. They support each other. Family sacrifices for family. The sheer audacity of her logic left me momentarily breathless. They had drained their entire life savings, mortgaged their home to the absolute brink, and let it go into foreclosure just to fund Ashley's extravagant vanity project and Kevin's delusions of entrepreneurial grandeur. And now they were twisting their own catastrophic financial irresponsibility into a badge of honor. You threw away your house to pay for a party and a failed business, I clarified, keeping my tone deadly flat. And your solution to becoming homeless was to drive across the country and break into my house. You have this luxury house, Vanessa, Barbara shot back, her voice rising in volume, echoing off the high ceilings. You are sitting on a pile of cash, living in a $4 million mansion all by yourself, while your own flesh and blood struggles. You owe us this. You have more than enough to share, and it is time you finally started acting like a part of this family instead of a selfish, isolated brat. Before I could tear her argument to shreds, the heavy footsteps of my father echoed from the hallway. Richard marched into the living room holding a crystal tumbler he had clearly just taken from my wet bar. He poured himself a generous splash of my expensive bourbon, taking a slow, appreciative sip before turning his attention to me. He looked entirely too pleased with himself, radiating the smug confidence of a man who firmly believed he was the smartest person in the room. There is no need to raise voices, Barbara, Richard said smoothly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Let Vanessa throw her little tantrum. It does not change the reality of the situation. He took a few slow, deliberate steps toward me, looking down at me with the same condescending expression he used when I was a teenager, asking for permission to go out. You need to accept the facts, Vanessa, he instructed, his tone patronizing and calm. We have officially moved in. Our furniture is here. Our belongings are inside the property lines. More importantly, my name is on the deed of this house, which makes me a legal co-owner. Because I am a co-owner, your mother, your sister, and your brother-in-law are here as my invited guests and permanent residents. He took another sip of bourbon, savoring the moment. Florida tenant and squatter laws are incredibly strict, he continued, sounding like he was delivering a university lecture on real estate law. We have established residency. You cannot just call the police and have us thrown out onto the street. The authorities will look at that deed, they will look at our furniture, and they will tell you this is a civil matter. You cannot kick us out without going through a formal legal eviction process. And since I am on the deed, you would have to sue me in civil court to force a partition sale, which takes months, sometimes years. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper. The courts are backlogged, Vanessa. By the time a judge even looks at your paperwork, we will have been living here for a year. We are not going anywhere. Get used to it. They had researched this. They had lost their home to the bank, packed up their remaining belongings, and driven to Florida with a meticulously crafted strategy to exploit property laws and hijack my home. They were using a revoked, fraudulent power of attorney as their shield, banking entirely on the assumption that the legal system was too slow and too bureaucratic to save me. They thought I would be paralyzed by the prospect of a lengthy court battle, that I would eventually just surrender and let them infest my life, rather than endure the stress of fighting them. They were severely underestimating the amount of stress I was capable of inflicting. I was just about to tell Richard exactly what I thought of his brilliant legal strategy when the soft padding of footsteps drew my attention to the grand staircase. Ashley was making her descent. She had changed out of her travel clothes and was now wearing one of my expensive silk robes, which she must have pulled directly from my closet upstairs. She looked incredibly pleased with herself, her blonde hair perfectly tousled, a smug, radiant smile plastered across her face. She glided down the remaining steps and walked into the living room, coming to stand right beside our father. She placed a hand protectively over her lower stomach, rubbing it with exaggerated slow circles. Plus, Ashley said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, the stress of an eviction battle really would not be good for the baby. I stared at her hand resting on her stomach. The puzzle pieces rapidly snapped together. The desperate cross-country move, Kevin's frantic attempts to hide inventory in my garage, the absolute refusal to accept any boundaries. They were entirely out of money, and Ashley was pregnant. "I am pregnant," Vanessa Ashley announced, her smile widening into a triumphant grin. "Kevin and I are starting our family. We needed a fresh start, and when Dad suggested we come here, it just made perfect sense. The schools in this district are fantastic, the beach is right outside, and there is plenty of room. This is the perfect house to raise a child." She looked around my meticulously designed living room, evaluating the space as if she were a prospective buyer walking through an open house. "It needs some redecorating. Obviously," she continued, waving a hand dismissively at my artwork. "It is a little too cold and modern right now, but once we put up some family photos and bring in the baby furniture, it will feel much more like home." She turned her gaze back to me, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Which reminds me." Ashley reached into the pocket of my stolen silk robe and pulled out a single sheet of standard printer paper. It was folded sharply into crisp thirds. She held it out toward me, pinching it between her index finger and thumb, as if she were handing a peasant a royal decree. "Take it," she commanded. I did not move my hands. I simply looked at the paper, then up at her face. "What is that?" "Actually, it is for you," Ashley stated, stepping forward and aggressively shoving the paper directly against my chest. "Dad and I drafted this online during the drive down. We found a great legal template." I let the paper fall from my chest, catching it before it hit the ground. I unfolded it slowly. The heading was printed in bold black letters. It was a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. It listed my name as the tenant and Richard's name as the landlord and property owner. Since Dad is the legal owner of the house, Ashley explained, her voice carrying a sickeningly cheerful conversational tone, he has the right to determine who occupies the property. And since Kevin and I are taking the master suite, and Mom and Dad need the guest rooms, you being here is just going to create a lot of unnecessary hostility and crowding. We do not want that kind of negative energy around the baby." She crossed her arms, mirroring my father's arrogant posture. "We are formally evicting you, Vanessa. You have 30 days to pack up your things and find a new place to live. Do not worry, we will give you a good reference for your next landlord." I stared at the flimsy piece of printer paper in my hand. The ink was slightly smeared, and I could see where they had hastily filled in the blanks of a free online template. They had even misspelled my middle name. It was a pathetic, legally worthless document, but to them it was an absolute decree. Ashley stood there with her hands on her hips, her chin jutted out, waiting for the explosion. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to cry. My father and mother watched from the living room, their faces etched with anticipation, ready to pounce the second I showed weakness. They thrived on my distress. It was the fuel that powered their entire family dynamic. I looked up from the paper and met Ashley's expectant gaze. I let out a slow, steady breath, completely draining all emotion from my face. "Okay," I said softly. 30 days. I turned around, walked down the hallway, descended the stairs into the basement, and locked the solid wood door behind me with a loud, definitive click. Down in the cool, quiet space of the lower level, I went straight to work. The basement was expansive, and over the next few hours, I transformed a corner of it into a secure command center. I set up my dual monitors, connected my encrypted drives, and pulled up the live feeds from the security cameras hidden throughout the house. I was not hiding. I was waiting. I was giving them enough rope to hang themselves, and they grabbed it with both hands. Over the next 2 weeks, my family took absolute advantage of what they perceived as my total surrender. They treated my $4 million property like a cheap party house. Because I rarely ventured upstairs during the day, choosing to order groceries online and retrieve them quietly, they acted as if I had already ceased to exist. The noise was relentless. Richard commandeered my expensive outdoor sound system, blasting classic rock from the deck at all hours of the day, while he drank my top-shelf liquor. Sand was tracked endlessly across the dark hardwood floors, grinding into the finish. Wet sandy beach towels were carelessly tossed over the custom silk upholstery of my living room furniture. Empty wine bottles, greasy takeout containers, and half-eaten plates of food cluttered the pristine marble kitchen island. They were a plague of locusts, consuming and destroying everything in their path. Whenever I did have to go upstairs to use the main kitchen or do laundry, the psychological harassment was immediate and coordinated. Ashley treated my presence like a toxic hazard. The moment I stepped into the room, she would dramatically place a hand over her stomach, sigh heavily, and turn away. "Can you please just go back downstairs?" she snapped at me one afternoon while I was pouring a glass of water. "Your negative energy is suffocating. I am trying to focus on my pregnancy glow, and just looking at you is raising my cortisol levels. It is really bad for the baby." My mother chimed in right on cue from the living room, scolding me for upsetting my sister and reminding me that I was a guest in my father's house who had overstayed her welcome. Barbara had taken to wearing my expensive cashmere wraps, parading around the house online shopping on her tablet, as if she had not just lost her own home to the bank. I simply smiled a tight, close-lipped smile and retreated to the basement without a word. My silence infuriated them more than any argument ever could, but it also emboldened them. They genuinely believed I had given up. They believed their aggressive squatter strategy had broken my spirit. They had no idea that every night while they slept off their expensive wine and unearned entitlement, I was watching them. My smart home surveillance system was state-of-the-art. The cameras operated in perfect high-definition resolution, equipped with night vision and highly sensitive audio receivers, capable of picking up a whisper from across a room. Sitting in the dark basement, the glow of the monitors illuminating my face, I recorded every single violation. I documented the property damage, the theft of my personal items, and the exact timeline of their hostile occupation. My years as a corporate auditor had trained me to build airtight, undeniable legal cases. I was methodically cataloging their destruction. But the most valuable intelligence did not come from my parents or my sister. It came from the golden son-in-law. It was 2 in the morning on a Thursday. I was reviewing the digital copies of my mother's recent credit card transactions, cross-referencing them against the stack of mail she had left on the counter when a motion sensor alert flashed on my secondary screen. Movement in the kitchen. I clicked the notification, maximizing the kitchen camera feed. The room was bathed in the eerie greenish-gray hue of the night vision lens. Kevin was standing by the refrigerator. He looked absolutely terrible. Even through the infrared filter, I could see that his face was drawn and slick with sweat. He was pacing back and forth in front of the island, his movements jerky and frantic. He kept running, a trembling hand through his hair, looking over his shoulder toward the stairs, as if he expected a monster to jump out of the shadows. He was holding his cell phone tightly to his ear. I reached over and turned up the volume on the audio feed. The kitchen was dead silent, amplifying Kevin's hushed, desperate voice with crystal clarity. "I know I am late," Kevin whispered into the phone, his voice shaking with raw terror. "I know. I swear to you I have the money. I just need a little more time to liquidate. Please, man, you have to talk to him for me. You cannot send those guys to my old house. I am not even there anymore." I leaned closer to the monitor. Kevin was not talking to a bank. You do not beg a bank loan officer not to send enforcers to your house at 2 in the morning. He was talking to a street lender. An aggressive, illegal loan shark. The son I always wanted, my father had called him. The brilliant entrepreneur. It turned out Kevin's startup inventory in my garage was nothing more than a desperate front for a man drowning in massive, dangerous debt. The voice on the other end of the line must have issued a violent threat, because Kevin suddenly stopped pacing and gripped the edge of the marble counter, his knuckles turning white. He looked like he was about to be physically sick. No, do not do that." Kevin pleaded, his voice cracking in the quiet kitchen. Listen to me. My father-in-law is loaded. I mean seriously rich. We just moved. He just put his name on a $4 million beachfront estate down in Florida. We are living in it right now. It is a massive property. We are practically owners. I went perfectly still, the only sound in the basement the quiet hum of my computer tower. I am telling you the truth, Kevin babbled, desperation making him reckless. Give me 30 days. Just 30 days. My father-in-law is setting up a massive home equity loan on this place, a line of credit for $1 million. I am getting my cut to fund the business. You will get every single dime I owe you plus the interest. If I do not pay you in 30 days, you can take it out of the house. Use the property as collateral. Just do not hurt my family, please. The line went dead. Kevin slowly lowered the phone from his ear, his chest heaving as he stared blindly into the dark kitchen. He leaned his forehead against the cool stone counter and let out a long, shaky breath, completely unaware that the actual owner of the $4 million collateral he had just promised to a violent criminal was sitting directly beneath his feet, recording every single syllable. I sat back in my chair staring at the frozen image of Kevin on the screen. The sheer scale of their collective delusion was staggering. My parents were squatting to hide from a foreclosure, and Kevin was using my father's fake ownership of my house to stall loan sharks. They were not just a toxic family taking advantage of a relative. They were a collision course of financial ruin and federal fraud all crashing together under my roof. I saved the video file, backing it up to 3 separate secure cloud servers. I had given them 30 days to leave. Instead, they had given me the exact ammunition I needed to ensure they never recovered. The 30 days of my supposed eviction period began with a relentless campaign of psychological warfare from my family. They operated under the assumption that if they made my life miserable enough, I would simply pack my bags and abandon my $4 million property before the month was over. They took absolute possession of the upper floors, and their behavior escalated from entitled to destructive. The pristine white oak floors were constantly tracked with wet sand. Empty bottles of expensive wine from my private cellar were left discarded on the kitchen island. They threw wild, noisy gatherings on the deck late into the night, blasting music over the outdoor speakers, while I sat in the basement monitoring the chaos through my hidden security cameras. Ashley was the worst of them all. She reveled in her perceived victory, making sure to loudly complain about my presence whenever I ventured upstairs to gather food or do laundry. She would dramatically fan her face and tell Kevin that my negative energy was ruining her pregnancy glow. She claimed the sheer stress of sharing a roof with her unemployed, jealous spinster sister was elevating her blood pressure. Barbara and Richard coddled her, rushing to her side with fresh fruit and reassurances that I would be gone soon enough. I said nothing. I simply smiled, retreated to my basement command center, and continued to meticulously document every single violation, every stolen bottle of wine, and every piece of damaged property. The real turning point arrived a week into their occupation. I was sitting at my dual monitor setup, reviewing the footage from the previous night, specifically the frantic phone call Kevin had made to his loan shark. I was interrupted by the heavy, authoritative stomping of my mother descending the wooden stairs to the basement. She pushed the door open without knocking and stood on the bottom step looking around the unfinished concrete space with profound disgust. She informed me that they were hosting a massive combination housewarming and baby shower that upcoming Saturday. According to Barbara, Kevin had invited several high-net-worth individuals who were interested in funding his new nutritional supplement startup. She explicitly told me that they needed to project an image of absolute wealth and stability to secure the investments Kevin desperately needed. I asked her how she planned to pay for a luxury event when she and my father were currently hiding from a bank foreclosure. Barbara completely ignored the question. She simply glared at me and demanded that I either stay hidden in the basement during the entire event or make myself useful by cleaning up after the guests. She turned on her heel and marched back upstairs before I could respond. I turned back to my computer, my mind racing. I knew my parents were entirely bankrupt. Kevin was drowning in illegal debt to dangerous people. There was absolutely zero chance they had the liquid capital to host a high-end catering event for wealthy investors in Destin. The answer arrived less than 2 hours later, announced by a sharp vibrating alert from my personal cell phone. It was an automated fraud prevention text message from my corporate banking institution. The message asked me to verify a pending charge of $15,000 at Coastal Elite Catering and Events. I immediately logged into my secure banking portal. The charge had been placed on a specific corporate credit card tied to an LLC. I managed a card that had been mailed to the house just 3 days prior. I had noticed a stack of my mail missing from the foyer console table earlier in the week, but I had assumed Richard threw it away out of spite. He had not thrown it away. Barbara had intercepted my mail, opened a sealed bank envelope, and stolen a corporate credit card. The standard protocol for any victim of credit card theft is to instantly freeze the account, cancel the charge, and call the police. My finger hovered over the fraud alert confirmation button, but the seasoned financial auditor inside me paused. Canceling the charge would stop the party, but it would only result in a minor domestic dispute. Barbara would claim it was a mistake, that she thought it was her card, and the local police would likely write it off as a family misunderstanding. I did not want a misunderstanding. I wanted a federal indictment. I opened my network monitoring software. Because I had installed the enterprise-grade wireless router for the house, I had complete administrative access to the network logs. I cross-referenced the exact timestamp of the catering transaction against the active devices on my network. The purchase had been made from an IP address assigned to Barbara Tablet. Furthermore, the digital authorization required an electronic signature. I bypassed the caterer's security portal using my corporate credentials and pulled the digital receipt. Barbara had brazenly typed my full name on the signature line. I sat back in my chair and watched the transaction switch from pending to processing. By letting the charge clear across state lines using a corporate entity account, Barbara had just elevated her petty theft to felony wire fraud and severe identity theft. I took high-resolution screenshots of the network logs, the IP address routing the digital signature, and the final bank authorization. I dragged every single piece of evidence into a secure encrypted folder labeled with my mother name. I let her buy the $15,000 party with my money, knowing it would be the exact rope she used to hang herself. When Saturday afternoon arrived, my $4 million property was completely transformed. A fleet of white catering vans lined the street. Valets set up a podium at the edge of my ruined driveway. Professional florists carried massive arrangements of white hydrangeas and orchids through the front doors. A classical string quartet was setting up on the back deck overlooking the ocean. The sheer audacity of the $15,000 display was breathtaking. 30 minutes before the guests were scheduled to arrive, Barbara pounded heavily on the basement door. I opened it to find her thrusting a cheap, stiff black fabric apron toward my chest. "If you are going to be in my house today, you are going to work." Barbara snapped, her face flushed with the stress of hosting. "We have 100 very important people arriving. Politicians, real estate developers, and Kevin investors. You will pass out the champagne, you will collect the empty glasses, and you will not speak to anyone unless you are spoken to. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" I took the black apron from her hands. I looked her directly in the eyes and offered a slow, compliant smile. "Perfectly clear," I replied. "I would love to help out." I tied the apron around my waist, grabbed a polished silver serving tray from the catering staff in the kitchen, and stepped out into the main living area just as the first wave of guests began to flow through the front doors. It was a masterclass in deception. Ashley stood near the kitchen island wearing a flowing designer maternity dress, graciously accepting expensive gifts and compliments from the local elite. She told a group of wealthy wives that she had personally designed the open concept layout of the house to maximize the ocean breeze for the baby. Kevin was sweating profusely in a tailored suit, cornering anyone who looked like they had money, aggressively pitching his nutritional supplement startup with wild, unsubstantiated claims about projected revenue. I moved through the crowd like a shadow. As the silent, subservient sister passing out glasses of expensive vintage champagne, I became completely invisible. People do not guard their conversations around the hired help. I kept my head down, offering polite smiles while my ears captured every word. I listened as Richard bragged to a local city councilman about his massive stock portfolio, claiming he bought this property in cash as a weekend getaway. I watched Kevin frantically pull three rough-looking men in dark suits toward the back patio, begging them in hushed, desperate tones for just 2 more weeks to secure their returns. The entire family was spinning a massive web of lies, intoxicated by the stolen luxury surrounding them. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a brilliant orange glow across the water, my father decided it was time for his grand moment. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut through the chatter, and the string quartet immediately ceased playing. The 100 wealthy guests turned their attention toward the center of the room. Richard stood proudly on the landing of the floating glass staircase, looking down at the crowd with the benevolent smile of a generous patriarch. Barbara stood to his left, beaming with pride, while Ashley and Kevin stood to his right, holding hands and looking like the perfect, successful young couple. I stood quietly near the base of the stairs, holding my silver tray tight against my chest, waiting for the climax of their delusion. "I want to thank you all for coming today," Richard began, his voice booming with practiced authority. "It is an absolute honor to welcome such distinguished guests into my new home." A murmur of polite appreciation rippled through the crowd. "When I purchased this magnificent estate," Richard continued, placing a dramatic hand over his heart, "I did it with one singular purpose in mind: family. I bought this property to ensure that my beautiful daughter Ashley and my brilliant, hardworking son-in-law Kevin have the exact life they deserve. I wanted to give them a foundation where they can raise my future grandchild in absolute security and luxury." The crowd erupted into warm, genuine applause. Ashley rested her head on Kevin's shoulder, dabbing a fake tear from her eye. Barbara looked out over the crowd, basking in the social validation she had craved her entire life. They were at the absolute peak of their fraudulent triumph. Then the heavy front doors were pushed open with such violent force that they slammed against the interior walls. The applause died instantly. The room went completely uncomfortably silent. Standing in the foyer was a hulking, broad-shouldered man in a custom-tailored dark suit. He had a thick, muscular neck and a face weathered by years of high-stakes, ruthless business dealings. He did not look like a local politician or a friendly neighbor. He looked like a man who destroyed people for a living. I recognized the type immediately. This was the man Kevin had been speaking to at 2 in the morning. This was the dangerous investor. The hulking man ignored the valets. He ignored the catering staff. He marched straight into the center of the living room, his heavy shoes echoing on the hardwood floor. His eyes swept the terrified crowd before locking directly onto Kevin. Kevin went completely pale, his jaw dropping open in sheer terror as he practically shrank behind Ashley on the staircase. The man took another step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked like he was preparing to physically drag Kevin out of the house by his neck. But as the hulking man moved through the parted sea of wealthy guests, his gaze shifted away from the staircase. He looked toward the kitchen, scanning the perimeter of the room until his eyes landed directly on me. I was standing perfectly still in my cheap black serving apron, holding the silver tray of champagne. The massive, furious man froze in his tracks. The murderous rage on his face was instantly replaced by an expression of profound, absolute shock. He blinked twice, staring at me, as if he had just seen a ghost. He ignored Richard. He ignored Kevin. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, his voice carrying clearly through the silent, breathless room. "Vanessa," he asked, completely ignoring the entire family standing on the stairs. He recognized me instantly. The absolute silence in the grand living room became an oppressive physical weight. 100 wealthy guests held their breath, their champagne flutes frozen mid-air. Richard stood on the floating glass staircase with his mouth slightly ajar, his grand patriarchal speech completely derailed. Kevin looked as though the floor had just dropped out from beneath his expensive leather shoes. All the color had drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. He shrank back against the glass railing, trying to make himself as small as possible, his eyes darting frantically between the hulking man in the foyer and me standing quietly near the kitchen. The man took another heavy step forward, his dark, calculating eyes locked entirely on my face. He did not care about the sudden drop in the room's temperature. He did not care about the sudden halt of the string quartet. He only cared that he had just walked into a luxury estate, expecting to confront a delinquent borrower, only to find a woman he deeply respected wearing a cheap black serving apron. I could see the gears turning rapidly in his head. This was Greg Mercer. He was the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Private Equity, a firm that managed billions in aggressive corporate acquisitions. 2 years ago, Vanguard had purchased a struggling logistics company. My former auditing firm had been brought in to review the books. I was the lead auditor on the account. Over the course of 3 grueling weeks, I had meticulously untangled a web of falsified ledgers and offshore shell accounts, ultimately exposing a massive executive embezzlement ring that the previous auditors had completely missed. My work had saved Vanguard Private Equity close to $80 million and sent 2 corrupt executives to federal prison. Greg had offered me a lucrative position at Vanguard on the spot. I had politely declined, preferring my independence, but we had maintained a profound, unspoken mutual respect ever since. Greg was a predator in the boardroom, a man who destroyed careers and liquidated companies before breakfast. He was also brilliant at reading a room. As he stared at me, his brow furrowed in deep confusion, I gave him a very small, incredibly subtle shake of my head. It was a silent, desperate plea. Do not expose me yet. Do not blow my cover. Greg caught the micro-expression instantly. He was a master of high-stakes poker, and he knew a bluff when he saw one. He smoothly pivoted his massive frame, turning his attention away from me and looking up at Richard on the staircase. He let out a booming, boisterous laugh that rattled the crystal glasses on the catering tables. "My apologies, Greg," announced his deep voice projecting effortlessly across the vast living room. For a moment there, from across the room, I thought your server was an old colleague of mine. The lighting in here plays tricks on the eyes. Please carry on with your beautiful celebration. I just need to grab a fresh bottle of champagne. He gave me a sharp, intensely pointed look that communicated an undeniable command. We are talking right now. Greg bypassed the crowd, walking with a heavy, purposeful stride directly toward the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. I turned and followed him, keeping my head bowed and my silver tray clutched tightly against my chest, playing the role of the subservient hired help to absolute perfection. The moment the heavy wooden door swung shut behind us, cutting off the chatter and the classical music of the party, the atmosphere in the kitchen shifted from chaotic catering prep to a deadly, isolated interrogation room. Greg turned to face me, his massive shoulders blocking the exit. He looked down at the cheap black fabric tied around my waist, his expression twisting into a mixture of absolute disgust and profound confusion. "Vanessa." Greg growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed off the stainless steel appliances. "What in the hell is going on here? Why are you wearing a server uniform in a house you own? And why is that sweating, pathetic idiot Kevin currently standing on your staircase claiming this property belongs to his father-in-law?" I set the silver tray down on the stainless steel prep table. I took a slow breath, shedding the meek, subservient persona I had been wearing all afternoon. I looked up at the ruthless private equity billionaire and laid out the facts with the clinical, merciless precision of a seasoned auditor. "They are squatters," Greg, I explained, keeping my voice perfectly level. "My parents went entirely bankrupt paying for my sister's wedding and Kevin's failed business ventures. Their house was foreclosed on by the bank. They drove down here, broke into my property, and used a revoked, fraudulent power of attorney to illegally add my father's name to the deed. They are using Florida tenancy laws to stall an eviction while they live rent-free in my house." Greg stared at me, his dark eyes narrowing as he processed the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the crime. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. "He came to me for bridge capital 3 months ago," Greg said, his tone turning lethally cold. "He pitched a high-yield nutritional supplement startup. It was a flashy presentation, but the numbers were garbage. When I started digging into the financials and demanding actual returns, he panicked. He begged for an extension. He claimed he had just married into a massive real estate fortune. He specifically told me his wealthy father-in-law just bought a $4 million beachfront estate in Destin, and he offered this exact house as collateral to secure the debt. I crossed my arms, feeling a dark, genuine sense of vindication wash over me. It is a Ponzi scheme, Greg, I stated smoothly. He has absolutely no inventory. He has no wealthy father-in-law. He is drowning in illegal debt, and he is using Richard's delusion of ownership to stall you from calling in the loan. He is promising you equity in a property he does not own, backed by a man who does not have a dime to his name. Before Greg could fully process the catastrophic magnitude of Kevin's suicidal stupidity, the heavy wooden door to the kitchen flew open with a violent crash. Ashley marched into the room. She was practically vibrating with blind rage, her carefully curated maternal glow entirely replaced by a toxic, vicious scowl. She completely ignored the massive, imposing presence of the billionaire standing next to me, assuming he was just another hungry, unhospitable guest looking to steal an early appetizer from the kitchen staff. She zeroed in on me with the predatory focus of a hawk. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Ashley hissed, her voice dripping with venomous entitlement. "You are supposed to be out there circulating with the champagne, not hiding in the kitchen socializing with the guests. You are embarrassing us, Vanessa. You are embarrassing my husband in front of his investors." I looked at her, then glanced at Greg. He was watching this interaction with eyes like chips of dark flint, his imposing frame perfectly still. He understood the dynamics of power and cruelty better than anyone, and he was currently witnessing a masterclass in petty familial evil. Ashley did not wait for a response. She was not looking for an apology. She wanted to punish me. She needed to assert her dominance and remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of her fabricated hierarchy. Her manicured eyes darted rapidly around the kitchen, searching for a target of opportunity. They landed on a small, recessed corner display shelf near the walk-in pantry. Resting perfectly center on that shelf was a delicate hand-painted porcelain vase. It was a stunning piece of craftsmanship, intricately detailed with blue and white floral patterns. More importantly, it was the only physical item I had inherited from our late grandmother. She was the only person in our bloodline who had ever shown me genuine, unconditional love, and that vase was the single most precious object in my entire house. Ashley knew exactly what that vase was. She knew exactly what it meant to me. She walked over to the display shelf with a purposeful, predatory stride. Her silk maternity dress swished around her ankles. She stopped in front of the porcelain heirloom and let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. "This kitchen is entirely too cluttered," Ashley stated, her tone dripping with a sickeningly false innocence. "It really ruins the minimalist aesthetic Kevin and I are going for." Without breaking eye contact with me, Ashley reached out her hand and casually flicked her wrist. The movement was precise and deliberate. Her knuckles struck the side of the porcelain. The vase tipped over the edge of the wooden shelf. It hit the hard, unforgiving ceramic tile floor and shattered into 100 jagged, irreplaceable pieces. The sharp, violent crash echoed loudly against the stainless steel appliances, a terrible final sound that made the air in the kitchen run cold. "Oops," Ashley sneers, looking down at the broken shards of my grandmother's legacy, and then back up at my face with a triumphant, malicious grin. "You really should keep your trash out of my house." She turned on her designer heel and marched back out to the party, the heavy wooden door swinging shut behind her, plunging the kitchen back into silence. I stood perfectly still. I stared down at the shattered pieces of porcelain scattered across the floor. My hands began to tremble at my sides. A surge of pure, unadulterated fury rose in my chest, a burning white-hot rage that threatened to completely break through my carefully constructed mask of clinical indifference. I forced myself to breathe. One slow inhale, one slow exhale. I clamped down on the emotion with iron, absolute control. I would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Not yet. Greg looked down at the broken porcelain on the floor. Then he looked slowly at the swinging door where Ashley had just made her triumphant exit. His massive shoulders tensed under his custom suit. He had just watched a pregnant woman deliberately destroy an heirloom just to inflict psychological pain on her own sister. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and slowly pulled out his cell phone. I was going to give Kevin another month to pay me back. Greg said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that sent a sudden electric chill straight down my spine. He tapped the screen with a thick thumb, unlocking the device and pulling up his contacts list. But nobody disrespects my favorite auditor. He looked up from the glowing screen of his phone, locking his cold, calculating predator eyes directly onto mine. Do you want to drop the hammer, or should I? I looked down at the broken pieces on the floor one last time. I visualized the absurd 30-day eviction notice Ashley had shoved into my chest. I thought about the federal wire fraud charge currently hanging like an invisible guillotine over my mother's head. A genuine, terrifying smile spread slowly across my face. Let them dig the hole a little deeper first, I replied quietly. The morning after the catering disaster, the house reeked of stale champagne and desperation. I walked up the basement stairs at 7 in the morning, stepping into a main floor that looked like a war zone. Half-empty glasses sat on every available surface, and the remnants of luxury appetizers were crusted onto the marble countertops. I moved through the wreckage with total detachment, heading straight for the kitchen to brew a pot of coffee. My calm demeanor was clearly having a profound psychological effect on my mother. The silent treatment was meant to be her weapon, but I had weaponized it against her. Barbara could not comprehend why I had not completely unraveled after Ashley destroyed our grandmother's vase. She expected me to scream, to cry, to pack my bags and flee in a hysterical fit of defeat. Instead, I had quietly swept up the shards, deposited them in the trash, and returned to my basement without shedding a single tear. This lack of reaction terrified her. It meant she had no control. Worst time was running out. Through the audio feeds late last night, I had listened to Barbara and Richard aggressively arguing in the guest bedroom. Kevin had told them that his investors needed proof of capital immediately. Richard was supposed to be finalizing a massive home equity line of credit against my property tomorrow morning, a fraudulent loan designed to pay off Kevin's violent street debt. But to secure that loan, the bank appraiser needed to walk through the house without the actual homeowner lurking in the basement. They needed me out of the house today, and standard bullying was no longer working. I was pouring dark roast coffee into my mug when Barbara marched into the kitchen. She was wearing a pristine white silk blouse and tailored slacks, looking entirely out of place amidst the catering garbage. Her face was set in a hard, determined mask. She marched directly up to the island, stopping just a few feet away from me. "Are you quite finished with this ridiculous silent protest, Vanessa?" she demanded, her voice sharp and echoing off the tile. "You are acting like a petulant child. You embarrassed us in front of vital business contacts yesterday by sulking in the corner. You are going to pack your bags this morning and leave before you ruin your sister's pregnancy entirely." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I looked over the rim of the mug, meeting her furious gaze with absolute deadpan silence. I did not blink. I did not speak. I just watched her. The silence stretched, pulling the tension in the room so tight it felt like a physical wire ready to snap. Barbara's face flushed a deep, mottled red. Her hands began to tremble with unadulterated rage. She realized in that exact moment that her words had absolutely no power over me anymore. I was a brick wall, and she was breaking her own knuckles trying to punch through it. Since verbal abuse had failed, Barbara instantly switched to her backup plan. She turned her head, looking quickly at the doorway to ensure no one else was in the room. Then she looked at a stack of heavy, expensive ceramic catering plates that had been left haphazardly near the edge of the counter. Barbara let out a sudden, ear-piercing shriek. It was a terrifying, guttural sound that chilled my blood. Before I could even register what was happening, my mother grabbed the edge of the marble counter, threw her weight backward, and violently hurled herself to the ground. Her body slammed hard against the ceramic tile. As she fell, she reached up and swiped her arm across the counter, knocking the entire stack of heavy catering plates onto the floor. The ceramics shattered with an explosive, deafening crash, sending sharp white shards flying in every direction. "She hit me!" Barbara screamed at the top of her lungs, rolling on the floor amid the broken plates and clutching her face. "Help me! She is attacking me!" I stood frozen, holding my coffee mug, standing a full 10 feet away from her. The sheer calculated insanity of the act left me momentarily paralyzed. Heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. Richard and Ashley burst into the kitchen, their faces twisted in theatrical horror. Ashley let out a dramatic gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Richard did not even look at me. He immediately pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed 911. "Send the police immediately!" Richard shouted into the phone, his voice shaking with manufactured panic. "My daughter has lost her mind. She just violently attacked my wife. Send someone right now before she hurts my pregnant daughter." Ashley knelt carefully on the floor next to Barbara, avoiding the broken ceramic. She wrapped her arms around our mother, stroking her hair, while Barbara wailed loudly, burying her face in her hands and sobbing dry, tearless sobs. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. They had choreographed this entirely. They knew they could not legally evict me without a lengthy court battle, so they were fabricating a domestic violence incident to have me forcibly removed from the premises by law enforcement. I did not try to argue. I did not try to explain myself to Richard or Ashley. I simply turned around, set my coffee mug back on the counter, and leaned against the island waiting. The police arrived in under 7 minutes. My house is located in an exclusive gated beachfront community where emergency response times are notoriously fast. 2 uniformed officers jogged through the open front doors, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. They stepped into the kitchen and took in the scene. Barbara was sitting on the floor, leaning against the lower cabinets, hyperventilating while Ashley held her hand. Broken plates were scattered everywhere. I was leaning casually against the counter on the opposite side of the room. "Officers! Thank God you are here," Richard announced, stepping forward to intercept them. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at my chest. "That woman is my daughter, Vanessa. She has been suffering from a severe unhinged depression ever since she was fired from her job. We took her in to help her, but she has completely snapped. She just threw my wife against the counter and smashed these plates." One officer, a tall man with a stern face, immediately moved toward Barbara to assess her injuries. The second officer, a younger woman with her hand resting firmly on her handcuffs, walked slowly toward me. "Ma'am," the younger officer said, her voice tight with authority, "I need you to keep your hands visible and step away from the counter." Barbara seized the moment, amplifying her performance. She let out a loud, shuddering sob and looked up at the officers with wide, terrified eyes. "She is violently unhinged," Barbara cried, her voice quivering perfectly. "She blames us for her miserable life. I demand an emergency restraining order. You have to force her off this property right now. She is a danger to all of us, especially my pregnant daughter." Richard nodded enthusiastically, adopting the role of the protective property owner. "I own this estate, officers. My name is on the deed. I want her removed from my house immediately. We need a restraining order filed today for our own safety." The younger officer stopped about 4 feet away from me. She looked at my perfectly calm demeanor, then glanced back at the hysterical scene on the floor. In domestic disturbance calls, law enforcement protocol dictates separating the parties and securing the primary aggressor. Right now, 3 witnesses were explicitly naming me as a violent threat. "I need you to step outside with me right now, ma'am," the officer instructed, her tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. She unclipped her handcuffs, the metal clinking sharply in the quiet kitchen. "We are going to go outside and have a conversation. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Ashley shot me a triumphant, vicious smirk over the officer's shoulder. They had won. They were going to have me dragged out of my own house in handcuffs, securing their fraudulent occupation. I did not turn around. I did not put my hands behind my back. Instead, I calmly reached into the deep pocket of my slacks and pulled out my digital tablet. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer warned, taking a quick step forward and reaching for my arm. "I am fully cooperating, officer," I said, my voice smooth, polite, and completely devoid of panic. "But before you place me in those handcuffs, you need to look at this screen." I tapped the security icon on my tablet and turned the device so the bright screen was facing the officer. "Officers," I stated clearly, making sure my voice projected across the room so my parents could hear every single word. "This entire estate is equipped with a military-grade 4K internal security system. Every common area is recorded in high definition with synchronized audio. The younger officer stopped. She looked down at the tablet in my hand. I pressed play. The crystal clear video filled the screen. It showed the kitchen from a wide angle, capturing the entire room. The audio feed played back Barbara's exact words demanding I pack my bags. Then the video showed me standing completely still, holding my coffee mug 10 feet away from my mother. It showed Barbara checking the doorway, letting out a calculated scream, and violently throwing her own body backward against the floor while simultaneously sweeping the heavy plates off the counter. It showed the entire fabricated assault in flawless, undeniable high definition. The officer stared at the screen. The tension in her shoulders vanished, replaced instantly by a hardened, furious glare. She looked up from the tablet, bypassing me entirely, and locked her eyes directly on my mother, who was still sitting on the floor amidst the broken ceramic. Barbara's fake sobbing stopped instantly, the color drained completely from her face. Richard's confident posture collapsed, his jaw hanging slightly open as the reality of the security footage registered in his mind. Ashley froze, her hand still resting uselessly on her mother's shoulder. I locked the tablet and slipped it back into my pocket, offering the officers a polite, cooperative smile. Now, I said quietly, the silence in the kitchen absolute. Who exactly would you like to arrest for filing a false police report? The young female officer stepped forward, her hand dropping away from the metal handcuffs resting on her utility belt. She stared down at my mother with a mixture of absolute professional disgust and unyielding fury. Filing a false police report is a severe criminal offense, the officer stated, her voice sharp and authoritative, cutting through the heavy silence of the kitchen. You intentionally brought emergency services to this address under the entirely fabricated pretense of a violent domestic assault. You wasted municipal resources, you lied to dispatch, and you attempted to weaponize law enforcement against a family member. I could arrest you right now, put you in the back of my cruiser, and let you explain those broken ceramic plates to a county judge. Barbara sat completely paralyzed on the cold tile floor. She could not catch her breath. She could not formulate another lie. The high-definition security footage had instantly stripped away her lifelong unchecked ability to manipulate reality. Richard took a cautious, cowardly step backward, physically distancing himself from his wife. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender, claiming he had only dialed the emergency line because he heard the terrible crash and assumed the absolute worst had happened. The officers completely ignored his backpedaling, turning their attention away from the pathetic display on the floor and looking directly at me. Do you want to press charges for the false police report and the intentional property damage? The older male officer asked, his pen poised over his official leather-bound notepad. I looked down at Barbara. She looked up at me, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a sudden, unfamiliar, and entirely genuine terror. She was entirely at my mercy. If I said yes, she would be dragged out of my $4 million estate in handcuffs. She would face immediate booking, fingerprinting, and a humiliating night in a holding cell. But an immediate arrest would halt the grander scheme. It would interrupt the federal wire fraud and the illegal mortgage applications they were currently orchestrating upstairs. A minor misdemeanor charge for a false report was a simple slap on the wrist. I wanted them buried under decades of federal prison sentences. I needed them to feel safe enough to continue digging their own financial graves. I offered the officers a slow, magnanimous, perfectly polite smile. Not today, officer, I replied calmly. My mother is clearly suffering from a severe, unhinged emotional breakdown regarding her impending personal bankruptcy. I decline to press criminal charges at this exact moment, but I would greatly appreciate it if you kept the video evidence and the incident report on file for my official records. The officers nodded perfectly, understanding the dark underlying threat I was leaving suspended over my mother. They turned back to Barbara and delivered a blistering, merciless warning. They explicitly told her that if they were dispatched to this address again for any fabricated nonsense, or if they received any more fraudulent emergency calls, she would be leaving the premises in the back of a squad car with zero hesitation. They turned on their heels and walked out the heavy front doors, leaving the kitchen drowning in a toxic, suffocating silence. Barbara slowly picked herself up off the floor, refusing to make eye contact with me. Richard swallowed hard, his arrogant posture completely deflated. Before either of them could even begin to formulate a recovery strategy or utter a single word of defense, the heavy, unmistakable sound of thick rubber tires crunching aggressively on the gravel driveway broke the tension. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling front windows, we watched a sleek, black, heavily tinted SUV pull up directly behind the departing police cruiser. The vehicle shifted into park, and the heavy doors unlocked with a loud electronic thunk. A tall, exceptionally broad-shouldered man in a sharp, tailored charcoal suit stepped out of the vehicle. He did not look like a local friend, a delivery driver, or a friendly coastal neighbor. He moved with a terrifying, predatory efficiency. He carried a thick, sealed manila envelope in his right hand. He bypassed the grand front entrance entirely, walking straight up the side stone path to the open patio doors leading directly into the main living area. He stepped inside the house without knocking, his cold eyes scanning the room with clinical, merciless precision. Kevin, who had been cowering near the landing of the glass staircase during the entire police interaction, suddenly went entirely rigid. The remaining color drained from his face. He recognized the man standing in the living room. It was one of Greg Mercer's private high-tier corporate fixers. "Are you Kevin Vance?" the man asked, his deep voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and bouncing against the expensive hardwood floors. Kevin swallowed audibly. He took a tiny, involuntary step backward, pressing his back against the glass railing, but there was absolutely nowhere to run. "Yes," Kevin whispered, his voice cracking pitifully into a high-pitched squeak. The fixer stepped forward, closing the distance in 2 massive strides, and slapped the heavy manila envelope hard against Kevin's chest. "You have been formally served," the man stated flatly, his tone devoid of any emotion. He did not wait for a response. He turned on his heel, walked out exactly the way he came, climbed back into the idling black SUV, and sped away down the coastal road. The heavy envelope hit the floor with a loud smack. Kevin dropped to his knees, his hands trembling so violently he could barely grip the paper as he ripped open the adhesive seal. He pulled out a massive stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. The bold, black, terrifying header on the very first page read, "Vanguard Private Equity versus Kevin Vance." Kevin let out a pathetic guttural sound that was half gasp and half sob. "Greg is suing me?" Kevin choked out, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text, his chest heaving with a sudden panic attack. "He is suing me for $2 million in defrauded bridge capital. The documents demand an immediate verified repayment within 24 hours, or Vanguard is officially filing federal criminal charges for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny." Richard rushed over from the kitchen, snatching the legal papers right out of his son-in-law's shaking hands. He rapidly scanned the severe legal threats, his own face turning a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. Greg Mercer was not a man who bluffed. He was a billionaire apex predator who had the unlimited legal resources and the sheer willpower to bury Kevin under a mountain of litigation and federal prison sentences. The illusion of their glamorous, successful, wealthy lifestyle was rapidly evaporating right in front of their eyes, leaving nothing but impending ruin. "Dad, you have to help me right now," Kevin pleaded, reaching up and grabbing Richard by the lapels of his expensive golf shirt. Kevin was sweating profusely, a manic, desperate, entirely unhinged light shining in his eyes. "You have the deed to this house. You told me you legally added your name using the power of attorney. You have to take out a home equity line of credit today. You have to do it right now. This beachfront estate is worth $4 million. You can easily pull $2 million in untraceable liquid cash to bail me out, or I am going to federal prison by the end of the week." Richard looked down at Kevin, then looked across the room at me standing quietly by the kitchen island. Richard knew the power of attorney had been explicitly revoked. He knew that adding his name to the deed of my property was a blatant, undeniable felony forgery. But Richard was a man entirely addicted to the illusion of absolute control and infinite wealth. He could not stomach the horrifying idea of his golden son-in-law going to federal prison and exposing their absolute financial bankruptcy to the local country club elite. In his supreme narcissistic arrogance, Richard convinced himself that he could easily secure the massive loan online payoff the billionaire predator and force me out of the house before the corporate bank ever discovered the fraudulent, illegal paperwork. "I will do it," Richard declared, his voice shaking with a pathetic fabricated bravado. "I will log into the premier banking portal right now. The online approval process for high net worth individuals is automated. I can expedite the massive wire transfer by tomorrow morning. I just need to upload the forged deed and the inflated property appraisal." Richard shoved past Kevin, nearly knocking the younger man over, and sprinted heavily up the wooden stairs toward the master bedroom, desperate to commit massive, undeniable bank fraud to save his crumbling family facade. Kevin collapsed face first onto the expensive living room sofa, holding his head in both hands, rocking back and forth in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. While Richard was frantically typing away at his laptop, actively committing federal financial crimes across state lines, and Kevin was hyperventilating into the sofa cushions, Ashley stood frozen near the hallway. She realized with chilling clarity that a $2 million home equity loan might not clear the bank's fraud department in time to stop Greg Mercer's legal hounds from destroying her husband. She needed immediate, untraceable liquid cash to secure her own escape. She needed a rapid contingency plan that did not rely on her father's desperate typing. Ashley slipped away from the chaotic meltdown in the living room. She crept silently down the main hallway and descended the wooden stairs into the unfinished basement. She knew this was my private sanctuary, the only space in the massive estate I still tightly controlled. She pushed open the heavy wooden door to my living quarters, her manicured eyes scanning the room with pure predatory greed. Her gaze immediately locked onto the far wall. When I purchased this magnificent property, I had carefully and meticulously curated an extensive collection of contemporary art. I had spent years acquiring specific authenticated pieces from emerging international artists. Hanging on the far wall, perfectly illuminated by custom museum-grade gallery lighting, were three striking, massive, abstract canvases. They were original, highly sought-after works by a renowned South Korean painter, complete with official gallery certificates of authenticity, taped securely to their wooden backing. I had purchased them at a private auction for $20,000 each, and their value had absolutely skyrocketed in the modern contemporary market. Ashley did not know their exact current market value, but she knew my expensive taste. She knew that anything I hung in a custom frame with dedicated museum lighting was worth tens of thousands of dollars. She stepped into the room, moving quickly, quietly, and ruthlessly. She did not care about the artistic merit or the delicate brushstrokes. She only saw immediate dollar signs. Ashley reached up and violently yanked the first massive canvas directly off the wall. The heavy mounting wire snapped loudly, and the metal bracket tore a jagged, ugly hole right through the drywall. She did not care about the damage. She grabbed the second canvas, then the third, ripping them down with reckless, greedy, destructive force. She tucked the three massive, priceless canvases awkwardly under her arm, the heavy wooden frames bumping forcefully against her hip and scraping against her designer maternity dress. She crept back up the basement stairs, entirely bypassing the living room, where Kevin was still sobbing uncontrollably, and slipped out the side door into the humid garage. Ashley popped the trunk of her luxury-leased sedan. She shoved the three priceless authenticated paintings inside the cramped space, not caring for a single second that the sharp metal corners of the trunk hinge were actively scraping against the delicate, irreplaceable canvas material. She slammed the trunk shut with a heavy final thud. She planned to drive straight to a high-end, exclusive art gallery downtown and illegally pawn my authenticated art for quick, untraceable cash. She thought she was being incredibly clever, a brilliant survivor escaping the sinking ship, completely unaware that my hidden motion-activated basement cameras had just captured every single second of her blatant felony grand larceny. I watched the live feed on my tablet as the taillights of Ashley's leased sedan disappeared down the private coastal road. The silent notification on my personal cell phone had arrived exactly 3 seconds after Ashley pulled out of the estate gates. It was not just the motion-activated cameras in the basement that had caught her act of felony grand larceny. When I purchased those three contemporary South Korean canvases, I had my security firm embed micro GPS tracking sensors directly into the wooden backing of each custom frame. I opened the tracking application and watched a pulsing red dot travel north along the highway. I did not need to run. I did not need to panic. I simply grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter, entirely ignoring my father, who was still frantically typing at his laptop in the living room, and walked out to my car. The drive into town was beautiful. The coastal sun reflected off the water, creating a brilliant, blinding glare that matched the sharp clarity in my mind. I drove at a leisurely, law-abiding pace, letting the air conditioning cool the interior of the cabin. The red dot on my screen navigated through the upscale commercial district of Destin before finally coming to a complete stop. I zoomed in on the satellite map. Ashley had parked directly behind Lumina Fine Arts. It was the most prestigious, exclusive contemporary art gallery on the Emerald Coast. Julian, the owner, was a sophisticated European expatriate who specialized in high-end acquisitions and discreet private sales. I knew Julian very well. 2 years ago, I had contracted him to authenticate and appraise a massive corporate art collection during a hostile takeover audit. We had maintained a very polite, mutually beneficial professional relationship. Ashley had inadvertently walked into the absolute worst possible building in the entire state of Florida to pawn my stolen property. I parallel parked my car across the street from the gallery. The large floor-to-ceiling glass storefront offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the pristine, minimalist interior. I sat in my car for a few minutes, simply watching the performance unfold. Ashley was standing at the main reception desk. She had hauled the 3 massive, heavy canvases inside and leaned them carelessly against the polished white reception counter. Even from across the street, I could see the dramatic, heaving movements of her shoulders. She was crying. She had one hand resting protectively over her pregnant stomach and the other aggressively dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I crossed the street and pushed open the heavy glass door. The chime echoed through the silent, acoustically perfect gallery space. As I stepped inside, the sheer absurdity of Ashley's performance became crystal clear. She was sobbing to Julian in a pitch-perfect, quivering voice. She was claiming that her wealthy husband had suddenly left her, that her bank accounts had been frozen, and that she was desperately selling her beloved family heirlooms just to prepare a nursery for her unborn child. She was laying it on thick, weaponizing her pregnancy to bypass standard authentication protocols and demand an immediate, under-the-table cash transaction. She painted herself as the ultimate victim, a desperate mother backed into a corner by a cruel world. Julian, ever the gentleman, was offering her a glass of sparkling water. He looked highly uncomfortable with the emotional outburst, but his practiced eyes had already evaluated the canvases leaning against his desk. He knew exactly what they were worth. He was pulling a heavy leather checkbook from his desk drawer, clearly willing to offer a fraction of their true market value for a quick, unquestioned sale. I heard him offer her $40,000. It was an insulting lowball figure for the trio, but to Ashley, it was an absolute fortune. She nodded frantically, reaching out a greedy hand for the check, completely blinded by the prospect of instant liquidity. I took a slow, deliberate step onto the polished concrete floor. My heels clicked sharply, drawing both of their attention. I looked directly at Julian, keeping my expression perfectly composed. "I wouldn't buy those," I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the pristine gallery. "They are registered on the National Stolen Art Database." Julian froze. The expensive fountain pen in his hand stopped an inch above the paper check. He looked up, his professional customer service smile instantly vanishing as genuine recognition dawned on his face. He knew exactly who I was. He knew my reputation as a forensic auditor, a high net worth collector, and a woman who absolutely never made unsubstantiated claims. Ashley whipped around, her tear-stained face instantly contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She completely abandoned the desperate crying mother persona, her hands balled into tight fists at her sides. "She is lying!" Ashley shrieked, her voice echoing harshly against the expensive artwork lining the walls. "Do not listen to a word she says. She is my mentally unstable sister. She has been stalking me." These paintings belong to my father. He gave them to me to help with the baby. Write the check right now. Julian slowly lowered his pen. He took a very careful, highly calculated step away from the reception desk, physically distancing himself from Ashley and the three canvases. He looked from Ashley's red, furious face to my perfectly calm demeanor. Vanessa, Julian said cautiously, his thick accent clipping the syllables. It is a pleasure to see you again. Are you stating for the record that these pieces are stolen property? I did not answer him with words. I pulled my digital tablet from my bag and tapped the screen. I opened my encrypted asset management portfolio. I set the tablet flat on the glass reception counter right next to Julian's checkbook. The screen displayed the official digital certificates of authenticity for all three South Korean canvases. The documents clearly showed the purchase history, the provenance, and the legal ownership tied directly to a private LLC that I entirely controlled. I swiped the screen to the next tab, revealing the live GPS tracking application. 3 pulsing red dots were currently layered perfectly over the exact geographical coordinates of Lumina Fine Arts. I stepped back and crossed my arms. My sister broke into my private residence less than an hour ago, I explained, keeping my tone strictly informational. She ripped those canvases off my basement wall, shoved them into the trunk of her car, and drove them across town to defraud you. If you sign that check, Julian, you are not making a savvy acquisition. You are actively participating in the fencing of stolen registered high-value art. You are accessory to felony grand larceny. Julian's face went completely pale. The art world ran on reputation, discretion, and strict legal compliance. Being caught buying stolen property could instantly shatter his gallery's accreditation and land him in federal prison. He looked at Ashley with absolute disgust. He reached under the counter and placed his hand firmly on the desk phone. "Ma'am," Julian said, his voice dropping to a cold, clinical pitch. "I am going to ask you to step away from my counter immediately. I am calling the local authorities to report an attempted sale of stolen goods. Do not touch those canvases. Do not move." Ashley looked at the tablet. She saw my name legally bound to the artwork. She saw the GPS tracker proving she had been monitored the entire time. The reality of the trap she had blindly walked into finally crashed down over her. She was not a clever survivor securing a quick payday. She was a petty thief caught dead to rights with the stolen merchandise on a silver platter. Her face flushed a deep, terrifying purple. She opened her mouth to scream, to hurl another insult, to try and twist the narrative, but no words came out. The sheer weight of the impending police arrival suffocated her lies. She looked at the front door. She looked back at Julian dialing the phone. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized control of her body. Ashley turned on her heel and ran. She left the priceless canvases leaning against the reception desk. She abandoned her entire fabricated story. She practically threw her body against the heavy glass door of the gallery, pushing it open and sprinting out onto the sidewalk. She scrambled into her leased sedan, the tires squealing violently against the pavement as she sped away completely empty-handed, utterly humiliated, and running for her life. I stood in the gallery watching her car disappear into the coastal traffic. Julian hung up the phone and let out a long, shaky breath, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He looked at me, then down at the paintings. I thanked him for his cooperation, gathered my artwork, and arranged for his private transport team to securely deliver the pieces back to my estate. I had successfully neutralized Ashley's escape plan. My mother was trapped with a false police report. Kevin was drowning under a massive lawsuit. My sister was a fleeing felon. They were completely cornered, stripped of their weapons, and entirely out of options. But as I drove back to the beach house, a dark realization settled over me. Desperate people do not surrender gracefully. When cornered, rats bite. The family had one last desperate play. The drive back to my estate was quiet, the rhythmic sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shoreline serving as the only soundtrack to my racing thoughts. Ashley was neutralized, but a wounded animal is always at its most dangerous when it realizes all the exits are sealed. I parked my car a block away from my house, intentionally keeping my vehicle out of sight, and approached my own property through the dense manicured foliage bordering the side yard. I slipped through the side entrance and moved silently down the hallway, stopping just outside the main living area. The atmosphere inside the house had shifted dramatically, from panic to a sickening, delusional euphoria. Richard and Barbara were standing at the kitchen island, clinking crystal glasses filled with my stolen vintage champagne. Kevin was slumped in a bar stool, looking pale and exhausted, but a weak, desperate smile had finally returned to his face. I pressed my back against the cool plaster of the hallway wall and listened as my father outlined his master stroke of federal fraud. It went through. Richard boasted, taking a massive gulp of champagne and slamming the delicate crystal glass onto the marble counter. The expedited home equity line of credit was pre-approved. They accepted the digitally uploaded deed without a single question. I told you, Barbara. Banks do not interrogate men with my kind of financial profile. They just rubber stamp the paperwork and release the funds. Barbara let out a high, triumphant laugh. Her earlier humiliation with the police completely forgotten, replaced by the intoxicating thrill of stolen wealth. So, when do we actually get the cash? She asked, leaning forward with predatory eagerness. Kevin needs that money transferred to Vanguard Private Equity immediately. Tomorrow morning, Richard declared proudly, the bank is sending a high-tier property appraiser at 9 o'clock sharp. It is just a formality for loans over $1 million. He will do a quick walkthrough to verify the square footage, check the luxury finishes, and sign off on the collateral value. Once he submits that report, the bank releases $1 million in liquid cash directly into my account by noon. We wire the money to Greg Mercer, we bail Kevin out of his legal mess, and we officially own this $4 million property free and clear. Kevin let out a long, shaky breath, rubbing his hands over his face. What about Vanessa? He asked, his voice trembling with lingering paranoia. If she walks upstairs while the bank appraiser is here and starts showing him the real property records or tells him the deed is forged, the bank will freeze the entire transaction. They will call the police, Richard. We will all go to federal prison. My father scoffed loudly, dismissing the threat with a wave of his hand. She is not going to ruin this. We are too close. We just need to keep her completely contained until the appraiser signs the paperwork and leaves the property. Richard slammed his glass down and pointed directly at Kevin. Get up, Richard ordered. She went down to her little basement bunker an hour ago. We are going to make absolutely sure she stays down there. I moved silently back toward the basement door, slipping down the wooden stairs, just seconds before I heard their heavy footsteps approaching the hallway. I stood at the bottom of the staircase and listened as the chaotic, violent sounds of their desperation echoed through the ceiling. They were not simply locking the door. They were building a physical barricade. I heard the heavy, excruciating scrape of the solid oak foyer console table being dragged across the hardwood floor. I heard Kevin grunting with exertion as they shoved it directly against the basement door. Then came the sound of dining chairs being stacked, followed by the heavy thud of decorative stone planters being dragged inside from the front porch to add extra weight to the barricade. Make sure it is wedged tight against the door handle, Richard commanded, his voice muffled through the thick wood. She cannot pry this open from the inside. She can scream and throw a tantrum all she wants down there. The basement walls are concrete. The appraiser will not hear a thing. We let her out after the money hits my account, and then we physically throw her onto the street. I stood in the center of my basement, looking up at the ceiling, a cold, genuine smile spreading across my face. My family had just spent immense physical energy locking a reinforced door to trap me inside my own house. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and greed that they had completely forgotten a fundamental rule of coastal residential architecture. Every finished basement in a modern luxury home is legally required to have an emergency egress window. I walked past my dual-monitor command center, past the custom art frames Ashley had destroyed, and headed straight into the guest bathroom at the far end of the basement. I pulled back the shower curtain, climbed into the large soaking tub, and reached up to the high rectangular latch of the egress window. I unclipped the locking mechanism, pushed the heavy glass pane outward, and hoisted myself up. I slipped through the opening with practiced ease, pulling myself out of the window well and stepping directly into the cool, salty night air of my private backyard. I dusted off my slacks, walked around the perimeter of my property, and headed back to my hidden car. I drove to a luxury hotel downtown, booked a suite for the night, ordered room service, and slept incredibly well. The next morning, the coastal sun rose bright and warm over Destin. I took my time getting ready. I wore a tailored navy blue blazer, crisp white trousers, and comfortable leather loafers. I stopped at an artisanal cafe near the beach, ordered a large iced coffee, and drove back to my neighborhood. I parked a few houses down from my estate and watched the street waiting for the final act of this ridiculous tragedy to commence. At exactly 8:55 in the morning, a pristine silver sedan turned onto my street and pulled smoothly into my long, sweeping driveway. A man stepped out of the vehicle. He was sharply dressed in a tailored gray suit, carrying an expensive leather portfolio clipboard. He adjusted his tie, walked purposefully up the front steps, and rang the doorbell. Richard swung the massive front door open before the chime had even finished echoing through the foyer. He was dressed in his absolute best country club attire, a light blue polo shirt, khaki trousers, and a gold watch he had undoubtedly bought using a stolen credit card. He stood tall, expanding his chest, radiating the smug, obnoxious aura of a self-made titan of industry, welcoming a mere employee into his domain. "Good morning," Richard boomed, extending a hand with aggressive enthusiasm. "You must be the appraiser from the bank. I am Richard Vance. Welcome to my home. Please come on in. We have a lot of ground to cover, and I am a very busy man." The sharply dressed man accepted the handshake with a polite, thoroughly professional nod. "Good morning, Mr. Vance. Thank you for accommodating me on such short notice. I just need to verify the interior finishes, check the overall condition of the property, and confirm the structural upgrades listed on your loan application. It should not take long at all." "Excellent," Richard said, clapping his hands together and leading the man into the grand foyer. My father immediately launched into his rehearsed, utterly delusional tour guide routine. As you can see, the open concept living area features authentic Brazilian hardwood floors. I had them imported specifically to match the coastal aesthetic. The kitchen boasts custom Italian marble countertops and commercial-grade appliances. I actually flew the contractor in from Milan to ensure the installation was absolutely flawless. The man nodded, making careful, deliberate notes on his leather clipboard, his eyes scanning the room. "The house is certainly impressive, Mr. Vance. The loan application states you purchased the property entirely in cash. That is quite a significant investment in this current real estate market." Richard let out a booming, arrogant laugh, completely intoxicated by the validation. "Well, when you have had the kind of business success I have had, you learn that real estate is the only safe place to park liquid capital. I bought this place as a weekend retreat for my family. My daughter is pregnant, you see, and I wanted my grandchild to grow up with a private view of the ocean. Speaking of which, let me show you the infinity pool and the custom outdoor kitchen. I spared absolutely zero expense." Richard led the man through the sliding glass doors onto the massive back deck, pointing wildly at the expensive patio furniture, the built-in stainless steel grill, and the stunning, unobstructed view of the Gulf of Mexico. Barbara and Kevin were standing near the outdoor fireplace, smiling nervously, playing their supporting roles in this grand, fraudulent theater. The man dutifully followed Richard, stepping onto the deck and looking out over the water. He clicked his pen, wrote another line on his clipboard, and turned back to face my father. "Everything seems to be in order regarding the physical property, Mr. Vance. There is just one final, rather crucial detail we need to address before I can officially sign off on this home equity loan." Richard beamed his chest, puffing out even further. "Of course, absolutely anything you need. What is the final detail?" Suddenly, the distinct electronic chime of the front door's smart lock echoed loudly through the open house. Richard froze. The arrogant smile vanished instantly from his face. Barbara gasped, dropping her champagne flute onto the patio table. Kevin whipped his head toward the house, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. They had physically barricaded the basement door. They had stacked hundreds of pounds of furniture against it. It was completely impossible for anyone to be opening the front door. Heavy, confident footsteps clicked rhythmically across the hardwood floor, echoing through the silent living room and heading straight toward the back patio. I walked through the sliding glass doors holding my iced coffee in one hand and my phone in the other. I stepped out onto the deck, the morning sun catching the gold watch on my wrist. I looked at the sheer, unadulterated horror painted across my family's faces, and I felt a deep, profound sense of utter satisfaction. I walked directly past my paralyzed father, ignoring him completely, and stopped right in front of the sharply dressed man with the clipboard. I offered him a warm, bright smile. "Hi, David," I said cheerfully, taking a sip of my iced coffee. "Thanks for coming out on such short notice. I hope the drive wasn't too bad." The man lowered his clipboard and returned my smile. "Not at all, Vanessa. It is always a pleasure to visit the coast." Richard stood completely rigid, his brain violently short-circuiting as he tried to comprehend the scene unfolding in front of him. He looked at me, then looked frantically at the man holding the clipboard. Vanessa, Richard stammered, his voice dropping an entire octave, trembling with absolute panic. "How did you get out of the basement? And why are you talking to the bank appraiser? You are going to ruin the loan." I turned slowly to face my father. The bright, cheerful smile vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, merciless stare that cut right through his pathetic, crumbling facade. "He is not a bank appraiser, Richard," I stated, my voice echoing clearly over the sound of the crashing waves. I gestured gracefully toward the man standing next to me. "This is David Sterling. He is the senior managing partner at Sterling and Hayes, the most aggressive corporate litigation firm in the state. He is also my personal retained powerhouse attorney, and he has spent the last 20 minutes documenting every single piece of evidence required to bury you in federal prison for the rest of your natural life." David calmly reached into his leather portfolio, pulled out a thick stack of court-stamped documents, and handed them directly to my father. "You are being sued for felony fraud, forgery, and grand larceny," Mr. Vance, David stated with clinical, absolute precision. "And the police are already on their way." The word prison echoed against the high vaulted ceilings of the living room, hanging in the air like a physical blade. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the massive estate was the rhythmic, indifferent crashing of the ocean waves outside the sliding glass doors. The brilliant coastal sunlight streaming through the windows suddenly seemed incredibly harsh, illuminating every bead of sweat forming on my father's forehead and every twitch of panic in his jaw. Richard tried to force out a laugh, a pathetic, dry, rasping sound that caught in his throat. "What kind of sick, twisted joke is this?" he stammered, taking a jerky step backward, his eyes darting frantically from David to me. "You think you can just hire an actor to come into my house and threaten me? I am a respected businessman. I own this property. I have the legal documents to prove it." David did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a slim black leather wallet. He flipped it open with a snap of his wrist, holding it up so Richard could clearly see the silver state bar credentials and the official government identification card secured inside. "I assure you, Mr. Vance, I am not an actor," David said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth, projecting the cold, clinical authority of a man who destroyed corporate empires for a living. "I am exactly who I say I am. And beyond my capacity as Vanessa's lead counsel, I have spent the last 48 hours coordinating this exact moment directly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Fraud Division in Miami. You are no longer dealing with family grievances. You have stepped firmly into federal jurisdiction." The remaining color drained completely from Richard's face, leaving his skin a sickly mottled gray. His knees visibly buckled and he had to reach out and grip the edge of the outdoor dining table just to keep himself standing. David bypassed my father entirely, stepping smoothly off the patio and walking back into the kitchen. He approached the massive marble island, the exact spot where Richard and Barbara had been triumphantly clinking champagne glasses just minutes prior. David unzipped his leather portfolio and withdrew 3 distinct, thick manila folders. He laid them out side by side on the cold marble, arranging them with the terrifying, methodical precision of a mortician laying out surgical tools. Let us be absolutely clear about the reality of your current situation. David announced, his voice projecting across the open concept living space, forcing every single member of my family to hear their impending doom. David placed his hand flat on the first manila folder. He looked directly at my father. At exactly 8:14 this morning, Mr. Vance, you successfully submitted a digital application for a home equity line of credit to a federally insured banking institution. To bypass the security protocols, you uploaded a power of attorney document. That specific document was legally revoked, officially notarized as invalid, and recorded with the county clerk over a week ago. Submitting a fraudulent, nullified legal document to a federal bank across state lines with the explicit intent of extracting $1 million is textbook wire fraud. It is also felony forgery. The bank's fraud department flagged the transaction the moment it hit their servers because I personally alerted them to anticipate it. Richard let out a strangled, breathless wheeze, his hand clutching his chest as if he were having a physical heart attack. The arrogant titan of industry had been completely eradicated, replaced by a terrified, cornered old man, realizing he was going to die behind bars. David smoothly shifted his hand to the second folder. His cold gaze locked onto my mother, who was currently trembling near the sliding glass doors, her perfectly manicured hands covering her mouth in silent horror. Mrs. Vance. David continued, his tone merciless. Yesterday afternoon, you authorized a $15,000 charge to a corporate black card for high-end catering services and vintage champagne. That credit card belongs to a corporate entity solely controlled by my client. You were explicitly removed as an authorized user prior to that transaction. Furthermore, you physically forged my client's signature on the digital receipt provided by the catering company. That is felony identity theft and felony credit card fraud. The catering company has already provided the police with the digital signature pad data and the security footage of you signing it. Barbara let out a high, piercing whimper. She looked down at the half-empty crystal champagne glass she had left on the patio table, suddenly realizing she was drinking the very evidence that was going to send her to a state penitentiary. Finally, David moved his hand to the third and thickest folder. He turned his attention to Kevin, who was still slumped on the living room sofa, his face buried in his hands, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the nightmare. "And Mr. Kevin Vance," David said, his words cutting through the air like a whip. "You deliberately used this physical residential address, claiming it as your own primary liquid asset, to illegally secure a bridge loan and defraud Vanguard Private Equity out of $2 million. You submitted falsified asset declarations to investors. While you were officially served with a civil suit this morning by Mr. Mercer's private fixers, I can confirm that Vanguard's legal team is currently drafting federal criminal charges for corporate embezzlement and grand larceny. They are submitting the paperwork to the federal prosecutor this afternoon." The absolute devastating totality of their crimes had been laid bare on the marble counter. There was nowhere to hide. There was no clever lie, no manipulative twist, and no aggressive bullying that could save them from the digital paper trail of their own unbridled greed. The silence that followed was absolute, but it only lasted for a fraction of a second before the illusion of their tight-knit, loving family completely and violently shattered. The narcissistic facade crumbled, and the instinct for pure animalistic self-preservation took over. They turned on each other with a speed and ferocity that was breathtaking to witness. "It was his fault," Richard suddenly screamed, his voice cracking with panic. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at Kevin. "He made me do it. He was drowning in debt. He begged me to use the power of attorney. He told me the bank would never check. He said his investors were going to send people to break his legs if he did not get the cash today. I was just trying to protect my daughter. He manipulated me into submitting that application." Kevin's head snapped up from his hands, his eyes wide with betrayal and pure rage. He scrambled to his feet, abandoning his terrified, sobbing posture, and charged toward the kitchen island. "You lying, arrogant piece of garbage," Kevin roared. His face flushed a dark, furious red. "You wanted that money just as much as I did. You have been broke for a year. Do not stand there and play the victim. Ashley planned this whole thing. My wife manipulated this entire occupation. She told me her sister was a weak, pathetic cash cow. She said Vanessa would just roll over and let us take the equity. Ashley told me you had the legal authority to sign the papers. You both set me up to take the fall for Vanguard. Barbara, realizing that her husband and her son-in-law were actively confessing to federal conspiracy in front of a hostile attorney, completely lost her mind. She dropped to her knees on the expensive hardwood floor, crawling frantically toward me. She completely abandoned her sophisticated, wealthy matriarch persona, reverting to pure theatrical desperation. "Vanessa, please," Barbara wailed, genuine tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She reached out and grabbed the fabric of my trousers, her fingers digging into my leg. "You have to tell him to stop. You have to call off the lawyers and the police. We are your family. We are your blood. I gave birth to you. I raised you. You cannot do this to us. You cannot send your own mother to prison over some champagne. You cannot let your father die in a federal cell. Please, Vanessa, I am begging you. We will leave. We will pack our bags right now, and we will never bother you again." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. For 30 years, this woman had systematically destroyed my self-esteem, minimized my accomplishments, and treated me like an absolute burden. She had allowed my father to financially bleed me dry. She had orchestrated an illegal occupation of my home, tried to have me arrested on fabricated domestic violence charges, and stolen from my corporate accounts without a second thought. And now she wanted mercy. I reached down, took a firm hold of her wrist, and physically peeled her fingers off my clothing. I stepped back, creating a cold, deliberate distance between us. "You stopped being my family the moment you treated my life like a blank check," I said quietly, my voice perfectly steady, entirely devoid of the emotional hysteria she was trying to provoke. "You did not raise me, Barbara. You survived off me. And now the bill has finally come due." Barbara stared up at me, the desperate, pleading look in her eyes slowly morphing into something dark-cornered and incredibly vicious. The realization that I was utterly immune to her tears, that the lifelong guilt trips had permanently lost their power, caused a violent shift in her psychology. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, her expression hardening into pure malice. "You cannot just throw us on the street!" Barbara spat, her voice losing its frantic pitch, settling into a cold, venomous snarl. "We have rights. We have been living here for weeks. You cannot just call the police and have us dragged out like common criminals. We have squatters' rights. We will refuse to leave. We will lock the doors and make you drag us out through the courts." Richard, who had been hyperventilating near the sliding glass doors while Kevin screamed at him, suddenly stopped. He heard the words, "squatters' rights," and his twisted, deeply arrogant legal mind latched onto the concept like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. A sudden, sick light of defiance sparked in his eyes. He realized that even if he was going to prison eventually, he could still inflict maximum damage on his way down. He squared his shoulders aggressively, smoothing down the front of his polo shirt, attempting to summon the last pathetic shreds of his crushed authority. He crossed his arms over his chest and glared at David, then turned his vicious stare on me. "She is absolutely right," Richard declared, a twisted, desperate smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "I know Florida real estate law better than you do, Vanessa. We are not trespassers. We have been residing in this property continuously. We have received mail here. We have established residency. Under the law, we are officially classified as residential tenants." Richard took a step forward, his chest puffing out again, fueled by the toxic thrill of finding a legal loophole. The police cannot forcibly remove established tenants without a court order. It does not matter what crimes you think we committed. You cannot bypass the housing authority. It requires a formal 90-day eviction process through the county courts. You have to file the paperwork, schedule a hearing, and wait for a judge to grant a writ of possession. He laughed, a harsh barking sound that held absolutely no joy, only pure, spiteful malice. He looked around the luxury living room, his eyes scanning the custom furniture and the beautiful ocean view. "You are stuck with us for 3 months, Vanessa." Richard gloated, his voice dripping with triumphant venom. We are not going anywhere today. We are going to sit right here in this $4 million house, drink your wine, sleep in your beds, and make your life an absolute living hell until the sheriff physically drags us out. You think you won, but you just guaranteed yourself a 90-day nightmare. We are not leaving. I let the silence hang in the air for a single beat before I laughed. It was not a chuckle or a scoff. It was a cold, sharp, genuinely amused sound that cut through the heavy tension of the room like a physical blade. Richard's defiant smirk instantly faltered. He clearly expected panic tears or perhaps a frantic phone call to the local housing authority. He expected me to crumble under the sheer weight of his aggressive legal posturing. My genuine, unbothered amusement deeply unsettled his arrogant stance. He looked at David, then back at me, his eyes narrowing with a sudden creeping suspicion. "You are absolutely right, Dad," I said smoothly, taking another slow, deliberate sip of my iced coffee. The ice cubes clinked softly against the plastic cup, loud in the dead quiet of the living room. Residential squatters are incredibly difficult to remove in the state of Florida. The laws are heavily skewed to protect established tenants, and the county eviction courts are notoriously backlogged. If this were a standard residential property, you could absolutely tie me up in costly litigation for 3 to 6 months while continuing to aggressively occupy the premises. You could force a drawn-out legal battle while destroying my home. Richard puffed out his chest, misinterpreting my statement as an admission of defeat. He shot a triumphant, vindicated look at Barbara, ready to claim his temporary victory and secure his 3-month reign over my estate. "But there is a fatal flaw in your brilliant legal strategy," I continued, my voice dropping to a hard, clinical pitch. I turned to David, who seamlessly retrieved a single thick, laminated document from his leather portfolio and handed it to me. "I did not buy this house as a primary residence, Richard. I purchased this entire estate through my private LLC. I had the property specifically and legally zoned as a commercial short-term luxury rental from the very first day the deed transferred into my corporate holdings." I watched the gears turning violently behind Richard's eyes. The sudden horrifying realization crept over his aging features as his twisted legal mind finally caught up to the reality of the trap he had just blindly walked into. A commercial zoning classification completely stripped away every single residential tenant protection he was trying to weaponize against me. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the grand front entrance. Fixed securely to the wall right beside the heavy mahogany double doors sitting at perfect eye level was a polished brass plaque. They had walked past it a dozen times a day since their illegal occupation began, entirely ignoring the small, legally mandated engraved text. "You never bother to read the fine print, Dad," I stated, my tone merciless. "That plaque explicitly states the commercial operating license number for this specific address. By Florida law, you are not residential tenants. You have zero established squatter rights. You are legally classified as transient guests occupying a registered commercial lodging facility. You bypassed the standard booking portal, you bypassed the required security deposit, and you occupied a commercial rental unit without offering a single cent of verified payment." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but the oxygen seemed to have completely vanished from his lungs. His confident posture imploded, his shoulders slumping forward as the inescapable legal reality crushed his last shred of leverage. "Do you know the specific legal terminology for occupying a commercial short-term rental without paying the nightly rate?" I asked, stepping closer to my paralyzed father. "It is called defrauding an innkeeper. And unlike a civil residential eviction dispute, defrauding an innkeeper is an immediate criminal offense. And the penalty for defrauding an innkeeper." Right on cue, the heavy front door swung open. David had deliberately left it unlocked when he entered the house. Two heavily armed, uniformed county sheriffs stepped into the grand foyer. Their heavy utility belts clinked against their dark green uniforms, and their hands rested cautiously on their radios. Their stern, no-nonsense eyes instantly scanned the chaotic scene in the living room, taking in the stacked barricade materials near the basement door, and the terrified faces of my family. "Is immediate removal and arrest." I finished, my voice echoing clearly over the silent, completely paralyzed room. I turned to David and accepted a single printed sheet of heavy bond paper from his outstretched hand. It was a perfectly formatted, itemized commercial invoice bearing the official legal letterhead of my LLC. I walked forward and pressed the invoice flat against Richard's chest, forcing him to take it with his shaking hands. The advertised commercial rate for this luxury coastal property is $2,500 a night, I stated, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact with my father. You and your uninvited guests have illegally occupied this commercial facility for 10 consecutive days. You owe my corporate management company exactly $25,000. Will that be cash or card? Richard looked down at the invoice. The paper was undeniable proof of their immediate criminal liability. If he did not produce $25,000 right now, he was not just facing a future federal wire fraud indictment. He was facing immediate on-the-spot arrest by the two armed sheriffs standing in the foyer. He was entirely bankrupt. He did not have $25 to his name, let alone $25,000. Kevin let out a high-pitched, panicked squeak and scrambled backward until he hit the glass railing of the staircase. Ashley stood frozen in the hallway, having just returned from her humiliating failed attempt to fence my contemporary art collection. She had walked through the garage door just in time to witness the absolute annihilation of their squatter strategy. The older of the two sheriffs stepped down into the sunken living room. He did not ask questions. He did not negotiate. He had already been fully briefed by David and the Federal Financial Fraud Task Force. He knew exactly what he was looking at, and he had zero patience for wealthy criminals attempting to exploit the system. Mr. Vance, the sheriff, barked his deep, commanding voice, leaving absolutely zero room for argument. You and your party are currently trespassing on commercial property and committing felony fraud against a licensed innkeeper. You have exactly 5 minutes to gather your personal belongings and vacate these premises immediately. If any of you are still standing inside this structure when that 5 minutes is up, you will be leaving my jurisdiction in handcuffs. The illusion of absolute control finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Richard dropped the commercial invoice onto the floor. His mouth opened and closed silently. The arrogant titan of industry was completely gone, replaced by a broken, terrified old man who realized he had just lost absolutely everything. He had no leverage, no legal loopholes, and no escape. Kevin did not wait to be told twice. He sprinted past the sheriffs, completely ignoring his pregnant wife, and burst out the front door, running blindly down the driveway toward his leased vehicle. Ashley let out a shrill sob of pure panic and chased after her husband, her designer maternity dress flapping wildly in the coastal breeze. They were abandoning ship, leaving my parents to face the music entirely alone. Barbara realized they were completely out of options. The federal wire fraud charges were looming. The false police report hung over her head. The corporate credit card theft was fully documented, and now armed law enforcement officers were actively ordering her out of the house she had tried to steal. She completely collapsed. Barbara fell to her knees on the expensive hardwood floor. She practically crawled across the room, ignoring the sharp look of disgust from the sheriffs. She reached out and grabbed my hand with both of hers, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into my skin with desperate, terrifying force. "Please," Barbara wailed, her voice tearing from her throat in a ragged, animalistic sob. Her pristine, sophisticated facade was entirely gone. Her expensive makeup ran down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "We have nothing left. Greg Mercer is going to take our house. The bank is going to freeze our accounts. Kevin is bankrupt. We have no house, no money, and absolutely nowhere to go." "Where will we go, Vanessa? Where are we supposed to go?" I did not pull my hand away. I did not flinch. I stood perfectly still, letting the brilliant morning sunlight wash over my face as the sound of the ocean crashed rhythmically against the shoreline outside. I looked down at the woman weeping hysterically at my feet. I looked at the mother who had spent my entire life calling me worthless, who had gleefully participated in my financial destruction, and who had actively tried to have me arrested in my own home just 24 hours ago. I looked down at her completely and utterly unfazed. I reached down my fingers, wrapping firmly and methodically around Barbara's wrists. I did not squeeze with anger, nor did I act out of malice. My grip was simply unyielding, fueled by decades of exhausted patience. I peeled her perfectly manicured hands off the fabric of my trousers, breaking her desperate clawing hold with total clinical detachment. She looked up at me, her face a mask of ruined makeup and shattered delusions, silently begging for the daughter she had spent 30 years tearing down to suddenly become her savior. "You can go anywhere you want, Barbara," I said, my voice completely level, barely above a whisper, yet carrying the absolute crushing finality of a gavel striking wood. "Just not here." The older of the two sheriffs stepped forward, entirely unmoved by my mother's theatrical weeping and breathless pleas. He placed a heavy, authoritative hand on Barbara's shaking shoulder, hauling her to her feet with the practiced efficiency of a man who dealt with trespassers every single day. The 5-minute warning they had been issued had officially expired, and the grace period was completely over. There would be no frantic packing, no gathering of expensive designer luggage, and absolutely no negotiating for extra time to collect their stolen belongings. They were leaving my property right this second, walking out into the humid coastal air with exactly what they currently had on their backs. The sheriffs corralled my parents toward the grand front entrance like wayward cattle. Richard tried desperately to puff out his chest, attempting to maintain a pathetic, lingering shred of his country club dignity, but the effect was completely ruined by his terrified, sweat-drenched complexion and the clumsy way his expensive loafers stumbled over the marble threshold. Barbara sobbed openly and loudly, her legs practically giving out as the officers physically guided her out of the luxurious foyer. They looked entirely pathetic, stripped of their unearned power and their stolen luxury, paraded out into the bright, unforgiving morning sunlight in their wrinkled, casual weekend attire. Kevin had sprinted out earlier, leaving his pregnant wife behind in a cowardly, selfish dash for freedom. But his desperate escape attempt had been spectacularly, beautifully short-lived. As I stepped out onto the shaded front porch to watch the final glorious act of this masterful eviction, I saw Kevin pressed violently hard against the hood of his leased luxury sedan. He was not dealing with the local county sheriffs. He was completely surrounded by 3 tall, broad men wearing dark, unmarked windbreakers. Federal detectives from the Financial Fraud Division had been waiting patiently at the very end of my long gravel driveway, anticipating his exact flight path. The distinct, heavy metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply and clearly in the otherwise quiet, exclusive neighborhood. Kevin's face was shoved forcefully against the polished silver metal of his car, his Miranda rights being read to him in a rapid, bored, entirely professional monotone. He sobbed, a high-pitched, wretched, humiliating sound of total and absolute defeat as the federal agents patted him down ruthlessly, stripping him of his wallet, his keys, and his freedom. He had gambled with federal wire fraud to save his own skin, and he had lost everything. Ashley burst out the front doors right behind my disgraced parents, her designer maternity dress billowing awkwardly around her legs. She stopped dead on the manicured front lawn, her eyes locking onto the driveway. She let out a blood-curdling, utterly hysterical wail as she watched the federal agents shove her weeping, handcuffed husband into the back of a dark, government-issued sedan. She screamed Kevin's name over and over again, her voice cracking with raw panic, but the detectives completely ignored her. They slammed the heavy car door shut with finality and pulled smoothly away from the curb, taking Kevin straight to a federal holding facility in Miami. Ashley collapsed onto the perfectly trimmed grass, clutching her stomach entirely alone, completely penniless, and facing the harsh reality of her own impending criminal charges. The immense chaotic commotion had absolutely not gone unnoticed. In a highly exclusive multi-million-dollar gated coastal community, absolute silence and pristine discretion are the golden standards. The flashing red and blue lights of the sheriff's cruisers and the harsh, unhinged shouting of my family had drawn an incredible audience. Several of the wealthy elite neighbors had stepped out onto their massive wrap-around porches or paused their morning dog walks along the beachfront path. They stood in perfectly pressed tennis gear and expensive leisure wear, watching the humiliating spectacle unfold with wide eyes and hushed judgmental whispers. Richard and Barbara stood completely frozen on the edge of the public sidewalk, surrounded by the glaring, judgmental stares of the exact echelon of high society they so desperately craved to impress. They had no car keys, no wallets, and absolutely nowhere to go. In Richard's violently trembling right hand, he still clutched a crumpled piece of heavy bond paper. It was the fake 90-day residential eviction notice he had hastily and aggressively drafted upstairs, the pathetic, hollow legal threat he genuinely believed would secure his 3-month occupation of my beautiful home. Now standing on the hot pavement, utterly ruined, publicly humiliated and facing federal prison time, that useless piece of paper was the only thing my father actually owned. They had been reduced to a pathetic roadside spectacle, a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. I watched them for one final deeply satisfying moment. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I felt the pure, unadulterated, intoxicating weight of decades of emotional manipulation, financial abuse, and psychological torment finally permanently lifting off my shoulders. I turned around, walked back inside the cool, quiet interior of my beautiful house, and firmly locked the heavy mahogany double doors behind me. The deadbolt engaged with a heavy, satisfying click, officially severing my ties to the people who had tried to destroy me. The transition to this next morning was absolute, uninterrupted bliss. The sun rose steadily over the Gulf of Mexico, casting brilliant warm streaks of gold, pink, and vibrant orange across the pristine, endless ocean water. The massive estate was completely beautifully silent. I had hired a premium elite emergency cleaning crew the previous afternoon. They had scrubbed, polished, and meticulously sanitized every single square inch of the property, entirely erasing any lingering physical trace of my toxic family. The broken contemporary art frames in the basement had been carefully removed, the guest bedrooms entirely stripped and perfectly remade with fresh linens, and the heavy foyer furniture pushed back to its proper elegant arrangement. The air smelled of expensive citrus cleaner and fresh sea salt, completely purged of their poisonous presence. I sat outside on the expansive back balcony, wrapped comfortably in a plush white silk robe, breathing in the crisp, clean morning air. A steaming cup of dark roast coffee rested perfectly on the glass patio table right next to me. The rhythmic, soothing, crashing sound of the waves below was the absolute only noise for miles in any direction. I opened my digital laptop, the screen glowing brightly against the morning light. I was not checking dense legal documents, reviewing forensic financial audits, or tracking stolen assets across the state. I typed a simple, familiar URL into the browser's search bar, pulling up a vivid, high-resolution gallery of exclusive private luxury villas located deep in the Maldives. I took a slow, deep sip of my dark roast coffee, feeling the warm, brilliant coastal sun on my face, and began planning my next vacation. It was a perfectly peaceful, deeply satisfying, and entirely quiet, close to a brutal, flawlessly executed masterclass in absolute boundaries, total control, and ultimate justice. Society often dictates that blood is thicker than water, but sometimes blood is simply the chain toxic people use to keep you tethered to their abuse. Vanessa's journey is a powerful testament to the fact that sharing a last name does not grant anyone a free pass to exploit, manipulate, or destroy you. For far too long, the concept of family loyalty has been weaponized against victims of narcissistic behavior, forcing them to endure silent torment under the guise of duty. But true familial love is earned through mutual respect, not demanded through a birth certificate. The most brilliant aspect of Vanessa's triumph was not just the flawless legal trap she laid. It was her profound, unshakable silence. When faced with her family's blistering arrogance and cruelty, she did not scream, she did not beg, and she did not attempt to appeal to the morality of people who possessed none. Instead, she prepared. She quietly protected her assets, secured her legal standing, and allowed her family's own unbridled greed to become the very snare that caught them. You never have to engage in the hysterical drama that toxic people manufacture to draw you in. You simply have to be smart enough to build an emotional and financial fortress they cannot breach. Walking away from abusive relatives is frequently painted as a tragedy, but in reality, it is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You are under no obligation to set your own life on fire just to keep your abusers warm. Setting ironclad boundaries, even if it means watching the people who raised you face the brutal public consequences of their own actions, is often the only way to reclaim your peace and your future. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect your peace from toxic family members, or found the courage to finally choose yourself? Share your story in the comments below. If Vanessa's masterclass in boundaries resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of triumphant vindication and reclaiming your power.